According to the Nars calendar, this horror began on March 4th, 1424. The continent of Nars became where one of the bloodiest wars, called Sonoma, began. This land was engulfed in a torrent of fierce flames, turning everything around it into solid ash. No one could stop the mighty demon king. Nothing was left but despair for a happy future. However, amid this pitch-black and thick darkness, a brave warrior appeared ready to give a worthy rebuff to the evil that had swept the earth. This was the plot and rules of the game Paradise, the name of which was displayed on the TV's big screen. In this role-playing game, the protagonist must confront the sinister demon king, after which he becomes king and leads his kingdom forward. Every evening, after a hard day's work and all other free time, he devoted himself to the fact that he gets incredible and genuine joy in this game. This man knew the game well, from the development of the protagonist to kingdom management, game bugs, dungeon attacks, and finding items. His blog about the game Paradise was in the first place for 10 years, but one day the guy couldn't and rotted away. This job was challenging and stressful, especially since he spent all his time on it. The gamer died from overworking his main job in gaming. But it scared him. In all his 34 years, he had never dated anyone, so he didn't want to die so quickly. However, after a moment, in a cold sweat and with heavy breathing, he sat down on the bed, and next to him stood the maid, who was frightened by his sudden movements. She stepped back a little and addressed him as if he were a king, saying that he had just had a bad dream and everything was fine now. The guy silently looked her up and down and turned to the room he was in. The interior was quite elegant. Realizing he had no idea where he was, he looked at the girl again and asked her who she was, since it was the first time he had seen her. She was genuinely surprised to hear such words, and thought it was a joke. For a while they both looked at each other in silence. She was shocked. The guy himself did not understand anything and had no idea how he had gotten to such a place. After a few minutes of thinking, he got up from the large, soft bed and walked to the spacious room's mirror. When he looked at himself, he refused to believe it. His body was in a terrible state. It took a lot to get fat to the point where his life was shortened by 20 years, but now he was no better than garbage. Unable to bear all he saw in the mirror, the man decided to calm down first and sat in a large chair nearby. The blond man's name was Shin Taepung, but it was a name from his past life. He had died of overwork and was reborn in the body of a fat king named Jared. Judging only by the graphics in Nars's presence, he had entered the Paradise game. Still now, it was no longer a game but an objective reality. If all these theories are true, then this life will soon end. The Great War of Sonma took place from 1414 to 1424. 5 years later, in 1419, there was to be a great drought and famine, a volcanic eruption and an earthquake, an epidemic and everything else. A whole catastrophe, and the Great War of Nars would begin due to the lack of food. If a war broke out in Nars, all the kingdoms would be involved, including this kingdom, and he was afraid to imagine what would happen to a fat man like him. Shin, and in his present life, Jared started to get very angry with himself because he was literally a living encyclopedia about the game Paradise. Still, he didn't know how to avoid such a disaster. In novels about rebirth, it was always written that the hero is reborn as a nice guy who lives a very decent life. But with him, it was the other way around. He was not as handsome as described and very fat, so much so that at that moment, even the legs of the chair could not stand and cracked under his weight. He fell loudly to the ground and hit his head on the floor. Without getting up from the ground, he remembered Jared as a child. And then it was already clear that this little boy would grow up to be a handsome man. But then something went wrong. But the boy did not give up. He knew that there was still a chance to fix everything. He could lose weight, although it would not be easy because it was worth the effort. This time, the guy did get up. He also had memories from his past life. There were too many glitches, and since he was alone in this world, he could take advantage of everything. Because of his knowledge of the game, he had more opportunities, and thanks to it, he could secure a great future for himself and achieve things that others could not even imagine. He thought that this would allow him to become the strongest warrior and be famous as a great king who united the whole world. And now this has become his main goal. Meanwhile, the maid was calmly dusting and cleaning the castle, humming a tune to herself. She was in a perfect mood. She wanted to clean the palace as well as possible today, so their king could use his study and feel comfortable. Suddenly, Jared burst into the room where the girl was and called out loudly to her. She immediately stopped cleaning and looked at the king, expecting him to ask her something. But the fat boy didn't say anything, and quickly, at least as fast as his body would allow him to do, he ran to look for something. He looked in every drawer but couldn't find what he had come for. Jared was already sweating because he wasn't used to moving at such a pace. Still, he needed to find the thing his father had left him after his death. He was getting angry because he had left something important in the rubble, and now it was nowhere to be found. The girl went to one of the drawers and opened it. Then she took out a large pendant and called out to the king, showing it to him. He calmly approached her and took the pendant from her hands, thanking her for helping him find it. The maid was also happy to have helped her favorite king find a valuable thing and asked if there was anything else she could do for him now. The boy smiled and asked her to leave the room for a while, and the maid silently walked to the door, not knowing what he was up to. The girl noticed that Jared was not the same as he used to be, too active and kind, which was a little alarming, but she put it down to his good mood. Compared to his usual state, he was too energetic. The girl was fascinated by the king's behavior and decided to follow his example, do her work, and clean the palace with the same energy. When the boy was alone in the room, he picked up the pendant and carefully examined it from all sides. It was an heirloom of his father's that Barrett had made especially for him, an artifact that enhanced magic. Jared stood with this thing in his hands and thought about what he should do with it now to prevent a catastrophe and live happily ever after. In the end, the boy decides to destroy his father's pendant. He will just break it. He remembered that in the game Paradise, the Fat King's only achievement was the title of a fourth-class magician. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not summon it with his magic. Sacrificing this artifact was now the only way to succeed and live in peace without war. In any case, he was ready to do everything he could to become even more substantial, and Jared believed his father would understand this decision. Eventually, the boy started to get it right, and his magic began to work, even though he could barely stand up from the gust of wind. After a while, out of this strange brown smoke, he saw a peculiar monster appear before him, wearing a long dark cloak with no arms and red eyes. The creature asked in a creepy voice who the person who summoned it was and why they disturbed it. Jared was a little scared at that moment, looking towards this monster. It was something that could be summoned only once in his life. Isabella's demon now turned into a long-haired creature with the same furious red eyes. It approached the guy, sweating with fear in a crucial moment. Isabella was not happy to be disturbed and summoned to the human world, but then the boy said he wanted her to make the best of him. He also knew very well about her that you shouldn't show fear in front of Isabella because this creature quickly lost interest in those who were afraid. You shouldn't worry either because she is attracted to open-minded people. Jared realized that this was his first and only chance. If he sent Isabella back now, he would never have another such opportunity. So he said what he needed, loudly and decisively, namely, he needed a spiritual eye. The powerful demon laughed, for what the boy wished for was indeed a potent ability that would allow him to see through people. He said firmly that this was exactly what he was missing. Only one person in the Paradise game could have the spiritual eye, so he wanted it for himself. The spiritual eye allowed you to scan the performance and character of any person, and depending on the user's level and abilities, you could see even more accurate information. Jared needed this ability to manage the kingdom and find promising players. Isabella was ready to agree, but she needed to give something, to sacrifice something. So the creature looked at the boy closely and asked him what was essential in his life. Isabella, who was much bigger than the boy, approached him and ominously said that he would have to pay for everything and not get anything for free. Isabella kept laughing and clearly laid out all the necessary conditions for the boy to receive the desired spiritual eye. He would only have to give away what he considered most valuable. If the most crucial thing in his life was wealth, she would make him poor. If it was fame, she would turn him into a slave in the next moment. And if it's family, the evil demon would be happy to eat them now. The boy froze in his tracks as Isabella read all the memories that came to his mind. It was the worst demon curse he had ever heard. But suddenly something extraordinary began to happen to her lips. Then Jared laughed and told her his plan. He had kept something valuable in mind all along, but not as much as he had thought because he had already known about her cunning plan and its terms. He succeeded in deceiving her, even though it was challenging to remain focused on the same thing and not get caught up in other thoughts. He was thinking about his first kiss, which he had kept in his mind for the past 34 years, but the demon hesitated. Isabella was against it. It was strange because what kind of idiot would think about his first kiss in such a situation? But she began to be literally pulled into him like a funnel, no matter how hard she tried to hold on to something. Isabella was almost at his face, even though she didn't want to be. Jared certainly wasn't too happy either because it was his first kiss with a demon, and he was disgusted by the thought. Later he succeeded, feeling light and proud that he had saved the whole country with this sacrifice. Meanwhile, the two maids were approaching the study. They were talking about Jared, who used to sit in one place all the time, but now he was a completely different person. His energy seemed endless. They kept comparing their king to his previous life when he didn't care about anything and was too lazy to get up from his chair. He looked normal on only one occasion, and his face took on a lively look only when he was eating. Now Jared could even go down to the basement, where no one ever goes, and the maid had no idea why he was there. She ran as fast as she could through the palace's corridors, and when she encountered the others, she immediately yelled at them to part and let her through. Hayes was running as fast as she could, and two others asked if she needed help, but she ran past them and said she could manage independently. Hayes was very hard-working and always did her best, but then she cried at night because the king didn't like everything and was always fighting with her, and the girls felt a little sorry for their friend. As Jared had asked, the maid took the documents and all the information about the royal family and went to his office. But when she was about to show everything to the desk, Jared stopped her and told her to stop at the door. He was already over the new powers that Isabella had given him. He had seen Hayes right through and was surprised that her loyalty was as high as S's and that she had so many other characteristics. Now he even felt sorry to leave her as a mere maid, so he made her a healer. She also had unrequited love in her readings, meaning she had been in love with someone for at least 10 years. Jared ran through his mind, thinking that he was too busy to have time to date anyone else right now, so he simply told her to give him the papers that Hayes was holding. She began apologizing to him as he leaned on the table and read the papers. Still, he had no idea what she was apologizing for. She looked down at him guiltily and said that she had to work even harder every time something like this happened to him. Jared's memories of Hayes gradually surfaced because he had assigned her most of the essential tasks. He would take it out on her like a madman if something didn't go according to plan. He realized it wasn't him but still felt guilty towards the girl. He reached out to her, and the girl was already afraid she would be again punished for a poorly performed task. She expected the worst, closing her eyes. To Hayes' surprise, instead of mocking her again, Jared hugged her tightly and sincerely apologized for the past. He apologized for hurting her and thanked her for never complaining about him and always trusting his words. He promised never to stoop to such a level again and that everything would be much better in the future. He pulled away a little, looked her in the eye, and asked if she could believe him for the last time. She was shocked that Jared acted like this. He was usually more cruel and didn't apologize for his actions anymore. Hayes was touched to tears and couldn't stop herself from crying. She hugged him again and assured him that she would be with him for the rest of her life, and Jared gratefully said that he was happy that she could forgive him again. He was Jared now, and he had to take responsibility for everything he had done, and there were a lot of bad things he had done. When Hayes pulled away and held back her tears, she spoke to him again and told him that things couldn't go on like this. Since Jared had decided to lose weight quickly, he would eat only grass. Still, if he ate only vegetables, he would lose his strength and get sick before getting the figure he wanted. But the boy said with certainty that he was a fat pig and would not eat anything else until he became slim, which would suit him. The guy knew that in the game paradise, one herb had a negative effect on satiety. On the other hand, this herb promotes a good diet. However, this herb tasted so bad that no one wanted to eat it. It was as if spoiled milk had been added to soybean paste, or the armpits had been rubbed with cheese. But he ate it because he knew that consuming Merlin grass helps to break down fat, and consuming aspa leaves helps to increase metabolism. Because there was an increased calorie consumption, about 2 times more than usual, he activated active stimulation and burned 450 grams of fat. Still, his weight was gradually coming off, although it might not have come in the best way because the greens still tasted terrible. Jared put his hands over his mouth, realizing that he might throw up right now from the nasty taste in his mouth. Hayes, who had been away for a while, brought another dish that looked quite appetizing. She invited the king to try the soy meat she had prepared. She blushed a little and told him that she had learned to cook this dish from a chef for him. She added that he had always thrown this dish away before, but she wanted him to try at least a piece this time. At that moment, the boy realized how terrible his character had been in the past because he had abused such an angel. The king tasted the soybean meat, and the taste lifted him to heaven. It was incredibly delicious. No wonder Hayes had A-level cooking skills. There was no trace of Merlin's disgusting taste. So Jared was going to eat everything Hayes had prepared. At the same time, he was looking at the documents and judging by them. He was now in the northern part of the country, and he remembered what kind of kingdom it was. The land was icy, so it was impossible to grow anything. It was a Class F desert land home to poisonous insects, wild beasts, and robbers. It may not have been the best place to live initially, but it had many charms. The problem was, however, that he was still too weak to take advantage of all these advantages. First, he had to change himself, and then he could take on the rest. As Jared contemplated his next steps, Isabella appeared before him, demanding that he give her the spiritual eye. He was surprised to see that the demon was still there, but she wasn't going to leave until he did as she said. She wanted the spiritual eye back because Jared had dared mock her like that when he kissed her. She began to threaten him and said she would follow him for the rest of his life and torture him until he died of it, and gave her the spiritual eye back. And that's when Jared realized that resolving this challenging situation would not be as easy as he thought. 10 years ago, someone began knocking on his castle door, asking him to open it. The young man with the small cloak on his shoulders knocked hard. It was sad to hear about the king's death, but now they all had to forget the past, stay calm, and think about what would happen to them in the future. Although no one opened the door, the boy kept knocking and assuring him that he would help him through such a complex and sad period. Then a young boy, Jared, who had just recently lost his father, sat in a dark room by his bed and cried, not wanting to hear or see anyone. It was still a fresh trauma, and all he could think about was his beloved father, who had passed away when he was so young. No one thought that anyone was summoned here for no reason. No one thought that anyone was called here for nothing. A young man with red hair stood next to the door with a bottle of alcohol, hoping to be invited to the New Year's Eve party. He opened the bottle and took a few sips. Afterward, he entered the palace and saw Hayes and another maid standing outside the king's room. He immediately rushed to hug them, especially happy to see Hayes. Still, she tried to pull away from him because he smelled of alcohol and misbehaved. She closed her eyes, hoping he would not touch her too much, and greeted Mr. Glegas, who said he liked her politeness. But her hopes were dashed when he again emphasized that she was too beautiful to love a fat pig like Jared. Glagus always focused his attention on her when he came and made a promise to himself that when Hayes was with him, he would. Luckily for her, Mr. Lacus soon entered the palace. He always argued with Glagus when he flirted with girls and told him not to do it again, but he didn't care and continued to behave in a very uncivilized manner. The elder always said that a servant of His Majesty should not behave like that. Hayes looked around happily. She was pleased to see him. Glagus, on the other hand, hadn't expected Lacus to come here and start bothering him. The boy got nervous when he started to lecture him, the head of public order, on manners. Glagus turned away and said he was always whispering something to the king, but he was always left with nothing and never came to his senses. These words really hurt Lacus, so he approached the boy with a stern face and ordered him to repeat what he had said to him. But Glagus only laughed at him, saying that he was so old that he could not even hear well. However, while they were settling their differences, an old man with gray hair came to them and ordered them to stop quarreling immediately. The king was coming soon, and it was unacceptable for him to see such things. Oberyn managed to stop them, but Glagus was not particularly happy to see the old man. With that toothless dog, and the old pensioner still hanging around and ruining the kingdom, Glagus wanted them to leave the castle as soon as possible. Lacus didn't understand how this rascal had been entrusted with such an important position, and Oberyn understood his feelings perfectly. Still, it would not be easy to change it. Ultimately, they gathered at one big table, eager to discover what had happened. They whispered among themselves, and no one believed that the king had initiated the meeting since he had always been passive in such a role. Jared was also reading the documents when his second chin disappeared, which was very surprising to the audience. The king was changing before our eyes. But Glagus continued to drink and became convinced that the rumors he had heard were true. When he had drunk enough, the man with the eye patch slammed his bottle on the table and said that doing this routine was unsuitable for the king. He suggested they end this meeting as soon as possible and go out and drink with the king. Glagus told him that he had brought another bottle of delicious liquor and that Jared would like to taste it. Finally, after he said that, Jared looked at Glagus and thought for a while, but he kept his eyes on the documents he was holding. The man suggested a good time with alcohol and inviting beautiful ladies, a method Glagus always used to delay the meeting, for the king liked such suggestions. Lacus, on the other hand, was determined to stop this outrage this time. Whatever happened, he was determined to put the man in his place for the sake of Crivius, and the country's people. But before the man could say anything, the king uttered a bizarre phrase for his person, pointing his finger at Glagus and asking him why he had come to the meeting so drunk. These words shocked everyone in the room, and Glagus had forgotten what he wanted to talk about because it was not like the king they knew so well. Glagus was panicking. He didn't understand anything at all because, not long ago, he and Jared had been drinking together, and everything was fine, and now it was as if the king had been replaced. These words made Jared even more angry, and he used his magic to smash the bottle of alcohol that the boy was holding. If it hadn't been for the importance of this meeting, he wouldn't have been so lenient. He would have dealt with Glagus's unacceptable appearance differently. This hurt the ego of this lover of alcohol, and even if he is a king, how can he use his own magic like this? Since there was no time for idle chatter, Jared put the documents on the table before everyone and continued his story. He asked if the chief of public order, Mr. Glagus, was satisfied that he could use his power to take money from ordinary merchants and use it to satisfy his needs. The boy was silenced by the truth that was told to him, and the king expressed his displeasure because it was because of him that the country's population became poor and the crisis began. People stopped trusting their king after such actions because everything they had gained with such hard work was taken away from them, and they were also illegally charged. Through Glagus, there was human trafficking, which was beyond the pale. Before that, there was illegal mercenary training in the territory of Krivia. Jared clearly told the whole truth about the chief of public order, who was utterly unfit for the position, and the king then called down a fireball. The way Glagus was behaving now in front of everyone, the king was willing to forgive within the confines of this broken bottle. Still, how he had sinned before the entire nation was not so easily forgiven. Jared stepped closer and decided how the boy would be punished. He would simply burn his face gently and be done with it. When Jared threw the fireball directly at Glagus's face, he immediately backed away, trying to escape. He was lucky, though, and the sphere didn't burn his face, but it did hit his back, and there were severe burns. Jared would have been ready to kill him for that, but he wanted to follow the law of the land, and that was what was saving Glagus. Jared decided that starting today, he would remove this scoundrel from such an essential position because such a person cannot remain at the top of the country. He also said that an investigation would be conducted into all the corruption operations that had taken place in the kingdom. After these words, many people fell to their knees before the king. They began to beg for forgiveness and apologize for this discrepancy. Glagus watched in fascination. Jared was able to extinguish Glagus, a significant character in Krivia, with a single blow. It was the power of a fourth-class mage from the Ukalis clan with deep magical roots. Such accomplishments recalled his predecessor, Lord Barrett. While Glagus was thinking about all this, Jared called out to him. Before he knew it, Jared had appointed him the new chief of public safety. He was so shocked that he could not speak. However, he was honored to be appointed and promised to carry this vital title with dignity. After the announcement, the king asked if there were any questions about the new instructions. Still, no one spoke up, and everyone agreed with the decision. At least Jared had managed to do something to raise the king's status, which was already below par. But there was still a problem with the distribution of personnel. Not a single person was in the right place. The Minister of Trade was appointed by accident. He had very little experience. The person responsible for trade was a skilled warrior, and the person responsible for agricultural development had a talent for storytelling. Suddenly, King Jared noticed Aubrey before him, looking at him in surprise. The king decided to fix everything immediately, which was possible because he now had the spiritual eye. After this important meeting, 1 month passed. Jared continued to solve matters concerning the country's future and try to raise his kingdom from its knees. A miserable and beaten merchant came to a small house begging for at least some money because, without it, he could not even trade. He begged to be pitied. However, the man to whom he came with his request refused and even threatened him that so far he had been good to him, so he should not annoy him. All he needed from this trader was to pay for the place, and he would be allowed to trade, but his pockets were empty. These local bandits thought Mr. Glagus hadn't been coming for a bribe lately, which he never missed, so they assumed he had just gone on a trip to warmer climes. Glagus had given him money, telling him not to spend it here and to keep it for himself, but the man was salivating at the thought of spending it on his own whims. Suddenly, the bell rang in their small pantry, and they were deciding who would open the door because no one showed up. Finally, one of them quietly walked to the door and peered through the crack to see who had come to visit. And it was King Jared himself, standing outside the door, smiling and waving. The bandit was even a little scared when he saw such a fat guy standing before him. But a moment later, he got a painful punch to the chin. Lacus was hiding behind the sweet king, ready to beat them and leave no living spot on their bodies. Jared said with the same joyful face that he didn't care that they were yelling at him. This blow was because they were illegally receiving money for space from merchants and residents of the entire kingdom. Jared ordered everyone to capture absolutely all the bandits who were there. Lacus was happy to fulfill this order from his king. Since he was the new head of public order, Lacus decided to start the trial immediately. The two criminals opened their mouths, realizing they had nowhere to go. Meanwhile, while the king and his ward dealt with these scoundrels, another criminal gently tried to leave the room, carrying a large sack on his shoulder. However, Jared noticed him when he closed the door, so he approached and did not let him escape. The criminal was about to run away, letting go of the sack, but Jared wasted no time using his magic to stop him. When the people saw this, they immediately began to applaud and loudly thank the king and the head of the guard, Lacus, because now they would no longer be deceived by these criminals. The knight in armor chained and handcuffed the three of them. They had been hunting this dastardly company for a long time, but could not catch them, so they were very grateful to the king for his help. Lycus also said that His Majesty Jared had confessed to his past misdeeds and promised to prioritize the lives of his citizens. And the fact that they caught these criminals was just the beginning of a new life. Such actions of the king should not be forgotten because they proved that his people were essential to him. On Jared's orders, bread was distributed to the hungry in the streets. At every step, the people emphasized that they should be grateful to the king for such decisions. Street musicians appeared on the streets, humming melodies to light instrumentals, and a new bright sun rose over Krivia. After a while, Jared called everyone back to discuss what had been done, and the community began feeling a little better about the top of their kingdom. This was indeed a great success because now Jared even had fans. People gradually began to admire him, and then he realized that he had not worked in vain. Jared asked how Lacus was feeling in his new position. The man was very pleased to be promoted to this status. He felt that this kingdom really needed him. The king sipped his tea quietly, and Lacus thanked him again for being promoted to a position he was comfortable with and well-versed in. And since his charges were happy, he was pleased too. Jared hoped that Lacus would lead his charges to the end and stay in this position. There were also statistics that could not but rejoice. Over the past month, all the criminals in the kingdom were caught, and security and public opinion were improving every day. Lakisu was given skillful soldiers selected by the king with the help of the spiritual eye, and all these soldiers were united under the king's name. This was all due to the spiritual eye, but Isabella was still not far behind and persistently tried to take it back. The Horde of Oberon, in turn, developed a new cultivation method. He was engaged in agriculture, but things were not going well in this area because of the long and cold winter and many harmful plants. Abila promoted Krivia's magic stone to the masses as a unique product. Still, good results took even longer to come. Without unique talents, there was no point in the spiritual eye, so Jared had to put in a little effort. While Lycus was sitting with the king at the table, he noticed something. Jared repeated the same action very often, so he wondered what it meant. Jared told him that it was a very popular exercise in other countries and that it was used to lose weight. Lycus smiled and signed him up for it because Jared looked increasingly like a real king without being so overweight. However, this move had nothing to do with dieting. It was a way to increase the performance of killing magic. To begin with, it was necessary to channel magic into both hands and back into the body, so you could cause a magic glitch that would strengthen it. Although the developers claimed that there are no yuan in the game paradise, this was far from the case. Using this method, Jared noticed the same effect of raising his level by 12 points within a month. With this method, he could use grade 4 magic once or twice more. While he was quietly practicing, one of his students burst into the room, urgently hurrying to tell him about something. The search party Jared had sent out had finally found a group of thieves who had found a hiding place in a mine. The king was amazed to hear that there were slaves there too. A year ago, 2 young boys were fighting with each other, both very skilled with their weapons. The boys were very absorbed in the fight and did not notice anything else around them while they were fighting. The blonde girl watched them in a dreamy and impressed way, admiring how well they used their weapons. However, their colleagues did not like it much, and they turned to the young girl with complaints, asking why she came here so often and watched them. At this rate, there could be trouble. But the girl smiled happily. She had no idea that the two of them would be here. The two men told her that she would face severe punishment if she continued to play hooky. She immediately ran to do her work, starting to carry the water barrels, knowing that she could easily catch up with the others because she was the fastest of them all. Lena was already 14 years old, and there were rumors that she would soon become a maid in a prestigious castle. She was happy to hear this because the headmaster himself had found this house for her, an orphan, so Lena was sure it was a great place. Her eldest was unhappy because she wanted to recruit Lena into their army. But suddenly, the girl turned to them both, and they looked at each other. The girl wanted to ask if she would ever be able to become a mighty warrior, maybe not now, but she promised to try hard to reach that level. The fact that she was going to the palace made her happy because there, she could have a better life. But she did not want to be a servant. Her small and young heart was on the way to fight. Her eldest asked her if she knew why there were so few women warriors in the world, and she pulled her sword out of its sheath. The world was too dangerous, and courage, desire, and effort were insufficient. Most of them simply gave up, realizing the reality of the matter, or lost their lives before they could leave the battlefield in time. But here, no one was an exception. Everyone was afraid for their lives. The key role here was the ability, talent for this work, perseverance, and will, which were all that were needed to become an ideal warrior. Lena's abilities exceeded both of them, so they could say with certainty that she would succeed in reaching her dream if she did not give up halfway. If she had nowhere else to go, she could always come back here. This was her home, and her eldest would hire her right away because she was the commander of the army. The girl was even more excited, her mood improved, and she was ready to work harder. However, when it came time to go to the castle, something happened that she did not expect. She was thrown into a dark dungeon and handcuffed. Memories of her first months at the orphanage flashed through her mind, and it seemed as if the head of the orphanage loved her very much. He called her an angel sent from heaven. At that time, their teacher said that he hoped the girl would continue to support them and be friends with everyone, and she was only too happy to do so. However, everything turned out not so happy in the end. The director of the orphanage simply sold her. He needed money, and they were ready to pay a lot for such an angel. Lena didn't want to believe it to the last, remembering how everyone in her previous home treated her. She thought it was a misunderstanding because she was supposed to be sent to work as a maid for a wealthy family. However, she was taken out of the sky, and the veil of reality was lifted. She was not just a maid, but a slave, and no one in this family cared about her. She shouldn't expect any favors from these people. They were cruel, and it made no difference to them whether she was a slave or an orphan. The only thing was that slaves should speak more politely and behave more quietly in the presence of important people. She clutched her head. Her brain did not want to accept the information that this had really happened. She knew that the director was a completely different person who was not even close to being capable of such a thing. But all of this turned out to be a bitter and terrible truth. A month had already passed since the girl was sold into slavery, and she was in a cell with other unfortunate children. During these weeks, she was subjected to physical violence more than once and spent almost all the rest of her time in a prison cell. There, she met a girl with whom she could sometimes talk, and they spoke many times when they were in the cell together. The girl with red hair, when she found out where she was from, said that slavery was her destiny, but Lena did not understand what she was talking about. She said that most orphans from Majorca ended up in slavery because that was the law in that country. Her director, in whose orphanage she found herself, agreed and had signed this law, so it was worth putting aside these thoughts and accepting reality. But 14-year-old Lena refused to believe it and sincerely thought that no matter what happened, she would escape and be free. Her friend had already given up trying to convince her that it was almost impossible because the girl stubbornly believed in her own. Still, Lena then asked if she wanted to be free herself. But Manny replied that she hadn't thought about it. She had lived here longer than Lena, so all they had to do was live together in this hell until they died in agony. Lena pulled away from her, her colleague's words depressing her mood, but Manny was realistic and soberly assessed the situation she was in. A whole month passed and she and Manny became fast friends. There were not too many child slaves in this place. They had no personal freedom and space, and they were treated like garbage, so most of them were like soulless dolls, doing whatever their owners wanted them to do. Slaves with a broken will were much less problematic, and it was not difficult to sell them. It might have been just plain luck, but she and Mani might not have worried until they were 15 because they were the most expensive slaves. But Lena knew she would never give up. 6 months passed, and they became accustomed to the constant hard work. During these months, she also realized that Krivia was a more backward country than Majorca. The girl was grateful to Mani because she taught her a lot. Lena knew little about this world before, and Mani told her that it was a desert land ruled by a king with no real talents. Thus, Krivian was gradually sinking deeper and deeper with each passing month. At some point, Lena became very curious about how her peers learned about all these subtleties of life in this world. Mani always gave the same answer. She just heard everything from those who put her here because she had perfect and sharp ears. Also, there were many monster hunters in Krivia, but there was no work for hired soldiers, so her appa and the ogres, about whom she often talked, would definitely not come here. However, she still wouldn't give up. No matter what she knew, Shock would get out of there someday and start her life anew. Mani shook her head. She was amused by the whole thing. She had never seen anyone more stubborn than this girl. And she really liked that about Lena. Eventually, the whole year passed, like one long and horrible day when they turned 15. Mani was sleeping that night. They didn't have a bed. The children slept on a simple cloth spread on the cold and hard floor, and they didn't even have a single blanket to cover themselves and stay warm. It so happened that Mani got sick because of all this. Her body was literally on fire. Lena noticed it and tried to wake the girl up because if she stayed like that, it would not end well. One of the bosses of this terrible dungeon, which consisted of several prisons, was very evil. Glagus shouted so hard for them to trust him. Still, he fell so quickly into the clutches of this fat king, Jared. The man was drinking something hot and complaining about his hard life because of Glagas, they couldn't even sell these dirty slaves, and they had to hide in some dungeons. She demanded that only 1 cup of warm broth be brought to the cell because her friend had a very high fever and was about to lose consciousness and die there. She fell to her knees and promised to obey orders and not say anything against them, but she needed that cup of broth, at least half of it. Perhaps he took pity on her, or was sick of hearing all these requests. In any case, Lena got her way, and Mani was given some broth. Her friend covered her with a piece of cloth because she was running a fever, and eventually Mani sat down to eat. Lena took care of her, and told her to eat until it was cold, and she was given something to eat and something hot to drink. The man took her by the arm and said that Mani had eaten by herself while she was there, and she had done business with him. The man was about to take her out of the cell, and Mani was not happy about it. But her friend assured her that she would be fine. The man took her face in his hand and turned it towards him. With a strange smile, he said that the patient should rest in silence, so they should leave her alone. But something hot flew into his eyes before he could take her away. Mani reacted quickly and poured the soup on his face. Taking Lena's hand, she exclaimed that now was the time to leave. The girl ran after her by inertia, but she didn't understand what was happening because they had just asked for soup. She just couldn't let Lena do that. The other slaves were ready to do anything because they had no incentive to get out, but Lena was eager. It was all she ever talked about, getting out, so there was no time to stop. This man was coming towards them. No matter how hard they tried to get out and run fast, the guard caught Lena by the hair and pulled her to him, but this time he was very angry. Although shocked, the girl immediately turned to him. She slapped him across the face, telling him to let her go immediately. When the man fell down, Lena turned to Mani, tears streaming from her eyes. Seeing that her friend was almost unconscious, Lena sincerely did not understand why she had sacrificed her own life for her. However, Mani barely audibly replied that her life was already too bad. There was nothing left to save, and she could not imagine herself different in the new world. She knew about Lena that this girl could not stay here. Mani grew up among bandits. All she saw were murders and brutal showdowns, so she was not capable of anything else. Lena had a good dream, even though she was an orphan. Mani wanted to protect the girl, realizing she needed this chance much more than she did. She believed that the girl could do anything with such a passion, so she finally told her to never give up in the face of difficulties. Lena promised in tears that she would get out of there for the sake of herself and her protector, by any means necessary. Still, she did not want to stay here, but the same guard who had recovered from the blow had already come for her head. Lena wiped away her tears as she continued to sit over the girl's helpless body, but she was ready to do anything to get out. Even kill anyone who got in her way. Sholovtsov did not let her move and quickly pressed her head to the cold and hard ground, holding his sword. He was furious that her friend had burned half of his face, and the two of them had been giving him a headache since the morning. But just as he was about to finish her, a voice came from the other end, distracting him from his task. And before he knew it, a wave of flames poured out on the man, burning his entire body. It was King Jared, and he showed him what a real burn was all about. Indeed, the small mine was Chad's real hideout, and Lycus asked Jared how he had found out. But the boy had figured out Glagus and the company's plans. They must have thought that after Glagus disappeared, the lazy king would make a little noise, but in a few days, everything would die down. That's why they came here, and Lycus asked with a smile if the king knew of any other hiding places for criminals. Jared, however, said that this was too much, and that he shouldn't be pushed too hard. The king turned around and ordered everyone to go inside the dungeon. He prepared himself and drew his sword. His great and mighty army of the best warriors had come to kill all those who dared to make slaves of ordinary people. For the sake of justice and by order of the king, they had to free all the mutilated people who were here. The main rule they had to remember was always no pity. These bastards must be punished for their actions. So, led by King Jared, the whole army went to the dungeon to win back the freedom of the citizens of Krivia. The king ordered all the people held hostage to gather in one place. The criminals started a battle and ordered the others to bring their leader to face the army of the kingdom of Krivia. However, the one who decided to go in search of Chad never made it because as soon as he set foot in the place, a sharp sword pierced him through the back. Lycus was serious about winning and was not going to let any of the criminals leave the scene. When part of this group was finished, the army was about to move on, but a new problem arose. There were too many passages, and they did not know where to go. So the king ordered them to split up and search all the passages. Now the soldiers of Krivia had a great advantage because the weaponry of these robbers was no better than that of an ordinary person. And at that moment, their leader was ready to kill the girl for what she had done. The man held Lena tightly by the hair to prevent her from escaping, but someone's voice came from the distance and stopped him. Jared and his army quickly found the orphan and the brazen man who wanted to hurt her, and the king used fire magic to guide him away. After he released the fire sphere at him, Jared walked closer to the girl. He remembered playing games and often coming across slave holds, but in real life it was very gross. The newly minted king approached Lena, who was on her knees in despair, and asked if she was okay. The girl quietly and timidly replied that she felt fine since others had come in time to save the child. But if Lena was a miracle and her health was incomplete, Mani, her friend, could not say a word. She had died saving Lena, protecting her, even though she knew it could have ended that way. The little orphan turned her face away to stifle the tears in her eyes in waves. Jared could have used magic to save Mani, but it was too late. Nothing would have saved her. The boy felt guilty for not being there in time and hugged Lena, who was covering her face with her hands and couldn't stop crying. She and Mani had become very close during this time, and losing someone like that was a big blow to her. Jared noticed that the girl's body was fatigued, thin, and unhealthily pale, and the skin of her hands was dehydrated even in appearance. She had been through a lot. While the king was trying to calm Lena down and somehow reassure her, Chad came into the dungeon, heard the noise, and decided to check what was going on. He looked around and saw the fat king, and then he got angry because he had not expected such a person to be in his prison. Chad stepped toward him, even though he was shielded in different directions. But he said that this lazy king would rather stay home and eat fatty meat than go to places like this. Jared was angry that his life was highly worthless. If even the last alcoholic knew him as a lazy fatty, the guy swore to himself that he would definitely catch him, or, even better, personally send him to hell. Chad laughed again, calling the king a fat pig, saying that people like him could not use magic. Jared was even more angry with himself when they made eye contact. And then Chad unleashed his own magic. Using the magic of lightning, he wanted to kill the king of Curve and free his mind from the intruders. But the lightning hit the wrong target. It hit the ground and did not touch Jared, who was about to use the magic of speed. Chad was astonished by this decision. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen any magician use such a spell. But Jared knew what he was doing. He thought out his plan and began to quickly wind circles around Chad, who was confused by this. He was drunk and could not perceive everything adequately, so he soon backed up and almost fell. But he decided to get a grip on himself, knowing that speed magic was the type of magic that was at the elemental level and gave the human body super speed. However, this spell was not easy to control, and therefore, many people avoided it. Chad still hoped that because of his overweight, it would be difficult for Jared to change his direction. Wasting no time, the criminal used everything around him and summoned magic again. However, this move plays a cruel joke on Chad. He begins to break and twist in different directions. This was not a very smart decision because he decided to use super powerful magic, which requires a lot of control when drunk, and that's why there were so many bad moments. Chad was so exhausted that he couldn't use magic anymore. He didn't even have the strength to get angry. Now Jared announced that he had completed the War on Crime task, which raised the people of Krivia's loyalty to 23. He also completed the task of destroying the Cave Company, which raised the level of allegiance even higher to 34. Thanks to this, the level of trust of the kingdom's inhabitants reached 100, after which the Lesser Golden Age began. As a result, Chad died quickly, and the mine case was soon resolved. All those who followed Chad and engaged in murder and kidnapping were ordered to be severely punished and were going to be put to death. The people who had been captured and were slaves were to be taken to their families, accompanied by guards. Sitting with Jared in the same carriage, Lena wondered, in amazement and surprise, if she could really go to his kingdom. The king smiled and replied that he would gladly accept her, because even if she returned to her shelter in Majorca, the director would still want to sell her again, which was dangerous. Jared was always looking for young and talented people to work with him, so he would be very happy and grateful if she decided to move to this kingdom. He was ready to take responsibility for her and make Lena a first-class knight, as she had dreamed of since childhood. She was overjoyed to hear the king's offer. Lena promised that she would do her best and definitely become the best knight in the kingdom of Krivia. She dreamed of living up to Jared's expectations, and he would be happy to watch her grow. He was very surprised even then, because he did not expect to see Lena Giselle Ellis here at all. Lena would be at the forefront of the Demon King's army 10 years later during the Great Manhwa War. She could easily deflect the attacks of hundreds of players. She was the strongest tank, impossible to lose against. She was even called the Weeping Cheese because it was impossible to pass through her. No one could take the fortress if it was guarded by Lena. The girl was a great defender of the Demon King's army. But it was even better that she had come to him in this story, because he could try to prevent her from joining the Demon King's army. It went without saying that she would be actively and intensely preparing for the Great War of Sonma. So Jared had already planned to make her a young star who would rise above the horizon of his army, not his enemy. The only problem remained with their not-so-best neighbor, Majorca. Since the illegal slave trade was allowed there, it was easy to assume that all other laws of the civilized world were being violated there, which meant that they did not have the best influence on their territory. Meanwhile, night had already fallen in Majorca, and they had many problems, especially with money. Lately, the head of this state has often heard how much people praise the Krivias, and such words about his competitors make him feel bad. The man sitting in the chair with the pipe knew that Frua had once been a friend of Glagas, so that was a good lead for them. It would be worth taking revenge for the fact that this fat man had dared to insult their colleague. It was supposed to be a quiet and peaceful night in the kingdom of Krivia, guarded by the state army. The soldiers stood outside the palace and watched closely to ensure that no one would cause trouble. However, they did miss someone who was deftly jumping from one roof to another and went unnoticed by the castle guards. The mysterious figure huddled under a dark cloak with a hood on his head was already standing next to his target. The guy carefully examined everything he needed, scouted the situation for his men, and then returned home just as unnoticed. It was morning, and Jared's new day started with a hard workout. He was so tired that his eyes started getting dark, but he kept running. Lena trained with him, and unlike Jared, it was very easy for her to run a few dozen big laps around the palace. However, he had to train even harder if he wanted to live up to his dreams of a handsome and slim king. He was doing his best, asking Lena if she was in a good mood after her morning run. Lena was pleased because the air in the mine was terrible. There was very little space and no opportunity to do the sport she loved. Jared ran up to her, dripping with sweat, and suggested they train together for now and find a teacher for her later. She agreed and liked it even better. In the meantime, they sat down to eat, but the cook overdid it a bit this time. And while the king of Krivia was chewing on his newly prepared meal with relish, a message from Lord Aubryn and Avel was delivered to his hands. Hayes had brought a letter that had arrived this morning after they had gone for a run with Lena. Jared opened the letter and read what was written. Everything was very simple, and Lena, who was sitting next to him and also eating breakfast, asked him to tell her what was in it because she was also curious. He read the whole magazine and decided to briefly tell what it was about. The bottom line is that Lord Auburn is engaged in the cultivation of crops called Retria, so there was some success in this area. Their kingdom was mostly importing food, so at least by doing so, they could reduce costs. Aval was able to attract the attention of monster hunters. There were now more than usual, and they could sell the crystals they got during the hunt. Compared to last month, the revenue almost doubled. Lena said that her friend had told her about Kriviri and that she was afraid to go underwater, but it turned out to be different. She liked living here. The boy was pleased to hear this because it was his great merit. Everything began to improve only when he took the throne, and very soon, all the continents would know about Krivia. Meanwhile, while the king was telling Lena about the kingdom's affairs, Lacus entered the hall. The thing was that he had something urgent to report to him. Lacus discovered something strange near the castle this morning and brought Jared to show him. Jared was furious and excited simultaneously, wondering what dared to do such a thing in the kingdom. When the door opened, they saw the corpse of a monster in a small storeroom and several more in other places. Lacus was at a loss for words, feeling guilty that he had not been able to follow up on this and that he should have spent more time and attention guarding the castle grounds. However, Jared assured him that he shouldn't blame himself so much. The main thing was that none of the residents were injured. Krivia was a tiny kingdom that didn't even have its own fortress, so it was unsurprising that they were vulnerable in such a situation. Now, citizen satisfaction is at an all-time high, so it's likely that someone from the outside is involved. Jared continued to ponder whose hand it might be when suddenly he and Lacus heard a call for help. Some child was screaming that she was ready to sell herself and give all the money, but she needed to help her mom. A little girl clung to a man's arm, demanding that he give her medicine for her mother, but he just said he had nothing. Jared decided to take care of it personally, so he approached the child and asked her name and what was wrong. The man stared in awe at the king who appeared before his eyes. The king asked what kind of medicine the girl was looking for her mother, and the people around him began to look in his direction, not believing their eyes. The girl stood next to Jared and introduced herself as Mia, telling him that her mother had Rennell's disease and she could not find the medicine she needed to cure her. Jared was very shocked when he heard the name of this particular disease. He knelt down in front of the king. He began to make excuses, saying that he had been told what medicine was needed to cure this severe disease. Still, no pharmacy wanted to sell him the medicine, and without the correct dose of pills, the disease was incurable. Jared thought about it. He knew that this disease could only be cured with the blessing of a great priest or with a precious medicine that could literally cure anything, and that medicine was made in China. Renella's disease was a lung disease similar to tuberculosis. It could be caught in dungeons or from wild monsters in the kingdom of Reinella, which is where the name came from. Jared sat beside Mia and asked her to take him to her mother. At her surprised look, he said he knew how to cure the disease. Hearing this, the girl did not hesitate to take Jared to their home, hoping he was telling the truth and that his method could help cure her mother. Mia started to climb up to the second floor because her mother was there, but Jared wondered if these shaky old stairs would be able to support his weight. The girl ran into her mother's arms as soon as she entered the room. Her mother was very tired and lying in bed. It was not the first time the girl had brought people who promised to help, so her mother did not believe it was possible. Mary looked up at Jared, mistaking him for a doctor. She immediately said that she had no money for treatment, so she asked him to leave, as the woman was now expected to die in 7 days. Seeing that time was running out, the guy realized that he had to act immediately. He assured her that he didn't need any payment. She just had to trust him. Mia looked at her mother joyfully, saying that this was not a doctor but a real king who had come to save her. The woman turned her gaze back to Jared and greeted him, letting him know she knew him, which he was shocked to hear. Mary covered her eyes and told him that 8 years ago, she had been invited to work as a cook in his palace. Jared had already realized nothing good could have happened there, so he immediately apologized. However, he hadn't considered his actions and was ashamed of them now. The king sat down next to her, to which the woman replied that it was better not to get so close to her, because this disease can be easily transmitted and is extremely difficult to cure. However, the boy reassured her that everything was fine. He asked Mia to bring him a wet towel, so she quickly ran to the bathroom to get it. Meanwhile, while she was gone, Jared opened the window and looked out. The corpse of the monster Jared had seen near his castle was lying under the house where the small family lived, and he wondered how long Mary had been noticing these creatures. It was not the first time she had encountered them. She had long worked as a cook for a group that sold crystals extracted from these monsters. Jared realized that Reinell's disease was not transmissible between people, but everyone who came into contact with these beasts got sick. The only problem was that the disease had no symptoms until the last, so most of those infected lived unaware of their condition. Mary held on to the last, but when she saw the corpse of an animal near her house, her condition deteriorated sharply. She already knew what end awaited her. The only question for her was when it would happen. Before he could answer her questions, Hayes and Lena entered the room, bringing all the medicines Jared had requested. The king happily told Mary to trust him. Everything should be fine, and he promised not to leave until her condition improved. Mary was sincerely grateful to him. She almost cried with happiness, but she still did not know how to thank the king for such kindness. Lena and Hayes had already begun to prepare everything they needed to help Mary. Still, Jared told her that she needed to get well first, and then she would think about how to repay him. And on the roof of that house was the same guy who had been involved in all the recent events, and he laughed when he heard that Jared wanted to make a medicine that didn't exist. But he didn't laugh so much when Lacus appeared behind him and confidently declared that their king had never been wrong. He cited that the criminal had shown up at the crime scene, just as Jared had said earlier. Lacus was unhinged when he saw this scoundrel who had dumped all those monster corpses in their kingdom, and now the inhabitants were at risk of contracting Reinella disease because of him. The masked guy said almost nothing, hoping to go unnoticed, but something went wrong. Meanwhile, Hayes and Jared began preparing the medicine, and Lena and Mia sat beside them and watched as they mixed the different herbs. Hayes was in a good mood and calmly mixed all the necessary ingredients. Finding all the required components was not difficult. Still, she did not suspect that all this fancy stuff was going to make a cure for Reinell's disease. Jared knew all about this game, so he remembered that while playing Paradise, people involved in pharmacy had developed a cure for this disease. While they were arguing about the right to income, someone leaked all the information to the website, and that's how he got the recipe. Thanks to this moment now, 10 years later, he is sitting and preparing this medicine to save a person's life. Mary was lying in bed. She could hardly speak, but still wanted to ask something. Even though she wanted to live, Mary sincerely did not understand why a man like him would work so hard for some poor person who was worth almost nothing to this world. Jared, however, only replied that anyone who has been constipated knows what it is and how unpleasant it is. It was surprising to hear that Jared, the king of Krivia, had also once suffered from Reinell's disease. However, he denied it, saying that he grew up in a loving family that always supported him. Jared took her hand and looked into her eyes, saying that there was something else besides his mother's sincere and devoted love. It was an ancient story. They used to live very poorly, and they were not in a position to have their mother examined in a hospital. But when they finally managed to get to the hospital, it turned out that it was too late. His mother had the last stage of cancer, which was incurable. As he sat next to her in the ward holding her hand, he felt more anger at himself than sadness. He felt so helpless in a situation he could not change. 15 years had passed since then, but he continued to blame himself for her death. Jared understood exactly how Mia was feeling right now, and that's why he had come to help. He didn't want to let her feel the same way he had felt a few years ago, so he was willing to do anything to make sure that this little girl lost her mom. Jared was saving her, and Lacus had to deal with the perpetrator in the meantime. They fought on the roof of the building, and both were very good with their weapons. However, Lacus was using brute force to his advantage. He should have used his speed to his advantage, and this fight could have been over long ago with one well-aimed blow to the target. The criminal moved closer and barely touched Lacus, continuing to stand in a fighting stance. However, this light blow did not shake Lacus, and instead, he arrogantly asked if this was all his opponent was capable of. The fact that this offender was so weak pissed Lacus off even more because, with such abilities, he had no right to attack Krivia. Then, the boy realized that Lacus was much stronger than he seemed. He was unprepared for this because no one had warned him that the head of the guard was so powerful. The boy pushed off the roof and flew into the air, buying himself some time, but he still wondered how Lacus had gotten so much strength. And the reason was simple. The fact that Lacus was much stronger than his opponent was hidden in his sucking abilities. which Jared could see with the help of the spiritual eye. During the fight with the thieves, his full order and the embodiment of justice maximize his physical capabilities. The criminal landed on the roof, unlucky to be on the same battlefield with such a strong opponent. There was no pity in his eyes at such moments. It was impossible to defeat Lacus. Initially, the guy did not want to give up until the end. He planned to kill his boss if caught. However, he had to abandon this idea. He had had enough adrenaline and excitement for the day, so he quickly turned around and intended to leave, but no one said he would be released. He called the man, who assured him not to worry because they would meet again soon. And then the battle will definitely come to the very end, until one of them drops his sword and falls down beside him, spilling his blood all over the ground. A thick smoke appeared around them, making it almost impossible for Lacus to see his opponent. Soon, he was alone on the roof of the building, which upset him because he had missed his prey, and that was unacceptable to him. Jared was almost finishing the session, and Mia was sitting there with hope in her little heart, watching his every move, thinking that her mom would be okay soon. Jared showed the little girl a small blob of mana created by his imagination. On the other hand, mana was created using a problematic method and intense concentration. Maria wondered why there was such a complex method if it was so easy to solve the problem, but Jared wanted to explain it to her. He told her that evil wizards burn all the mana nearby, and that those who use only the first method become fools, incapable of doing anything. Mia found it hard to imagine a magician who couldn't cast magic. It was horrible. That's why Jared told her she needed to practice the method with strong concentration, even if it was very difficult. Mia understood, but she was still interested in something else. She didn't understand why he wore such strange clothes and a mustache. But Jared only wanted to create a complete atmosphere since he had already become her magic mentor. But she was distracted again when there was a knock at the door. It was time for the meal, which could not be postponed. And Mia was only too happy because she was also hungry and did not care about some magic lesson that had not yet ended. Mia's mom entered the room thinking she had interrupted the lesson. Still, Jared didn't mind eating, especially since he was curious to try her food. Mary was wearing her professional clothes and beckoning for food. She was feeling much better and was no longer bedridden. However, Jared was worried about her. She had started working too quickly after such a long and severe illness. It would be better for her to rest in bed for a while longer and then start working. Still, Mary assured him that she had recovered completely, thanks to the medicine the king had prepared for her. As a token of gratitude, she tried to prepare breakfast according to his diet. The main dish was soy meat, which Jared loved so much, and was ready to eat several times daily. Isabella, who was never on time, suddenly reappeared, but she noticed that Jared had changed significantly. In any case, people will try to find the shortest way for themselves. For example, the same training method constantly glitches. Thanks to this bank, you could raise your mana level by 3 points in one day. However, such masters had little real experience and practice because of such dubious methods, which put them at a disadvantage to others. And only a few managed to fully customize this shortcut for themselves. A method of magic control that combines training and bugging methods with the mage's mana to increase the power of magic by as much as 6 points. Now the guy needed to name this training. This method should become its basis, so he decided that it would be symbolic to come up with a name that would reflect him. And that's how the name single-player bogeyman came about. Isabella was watching him, and she did this often. During this time, the demon noticed that his methods differed from other magicians. Isabella asked the boy if he could see specific flows that ordinary people could not notice. Although he was not playing by the rules, his mana level was more than acceptable. Isabella moved closer to the blond man and took him by the shoulder, beginning to suspect that he was not of this world. He panicked a little, and when he turned around, he began to deny her assumption. Isabella replied thoughtfully that she thought this boy had come to them from another continent. She wasn't sure, but she had heard that people from the Eastern Empire were said to have excellent absorption powers. Jared only replied that if you believe all the stories of their ancestors, you will hear many mystical things there. These are just legends. The Eastern Empire was a project the Paradise Game development team had worked on for 5 years. The guy was looking forward to its release, but he died before it happened and never had a chance to try it out in the game. As Jared recalled all this and remained silent, Isabella noticed he looked slightly disappointed. The demon touched him again, saying that something exciting was always happening while she was flying somewhere near him. Isabella suggested they talk openly since he could only see and hear her. When Jared heard this, he first said that he would not give her the spiritual eye, maybe not even hope to. But she was already ready to forgive him for this spiritual eye. She would not fight much over it, so she replied that he could take it as a wedding gift for her future husband, which shocked Jared. Isabella smiled, saying that she used to be disgusted to look at him when he was so fat, but now that he had lost some weight, he looked pretty good. Jared felt a little embarrassed, especially since she watched him sleep from the ceiling almost every night. Then she immediately snuck over his shoulder. Isabella was sure someone like him would be perfect for an innocent ghost like her. Besides, she reminded him that he had given her his first kiss in years, which put him to shame. At this point, Jared couldn't take it anymore and ran away from her as fast as he could, saying that he had to go to Ranella, to which Isabella offered to go with him. Although he was against it, she didn't really care. Lena was developing very quickly. She picked up everything on the fly, and he was surprised that he could see such abilities in this child at first glance. This also required good sense, but he already thought that in a month or two, his lessons would lose their meaning for her. As they rode in the carriage, Hayes pulled out a letter Lakis had asked her to deliver to the king. After reading the letter, he turned his eyes to the girl, saying that the most talented warrior in Krivia would last only another month. Jared realized that it was time to find a good teacher for her, so he promised to start looking for one soon. He already had a few candidates in mind, as he had recently come across someone he could trust to teach her. Suddenly, the carriage window shattered, and Hayes, sitting beside him, immediately jumped away. The king had already prepared to defend himself with magic. It was necessary to immediately protect the head of the kingdom from those who had ambushed him. While Hayes was recovering, Jared created a shield to protect them. At first, it was easy because the robbers' arrows were too weak. Soon, however, the shield began to crack, and Hayes rushed to protect it with her life. Jared didn't want to let her go. If she had been hit by an arrow, she would have died immediately. But it was her duty to protect him. Even though she was only a palace maid, Hayes decided to take the hit. However, Jared grabbed her and put her in her seat. He forbade her to go outside, and if she did, he would kill her himself. So after saying that, she agreed to stay put. It was too dangerous to go out. If an arrow hit the target, she could die the same minute. Isabella came to the rescue, but Jared immediately rejected her idea to help. The robbers determined that a mage was riding in the carriage, which complicated the situation. Tog, a mage assassin and robber for hire, began to suspect that their client had many reasons to get rid of this guy. When Jared heard it was about some mysterious guy in a mask, he remembered what Lakis had told him, and all the lines started converging. But the assassins shouted that nothing would help him, and began to advance from all sides, surrounding King Krivia's carriages. This time, they had a newcomer with them, so the group leader was going to show his skills to the highest level so that he could see how to perform the task. He walked a few more steps closer to the carriage and was about to slash everything with his powerful magic. Jared wasn't at a loss either. Like a king, he realized he needed to protect his people, so he tried to confuse Tog with speed magic again. But for the hired killer, it was just childish tricks, which he laughed at and took out a magic arrow. Jared used the shield that appeared next to his head. The current battle was not easy because Mage Killer is not just a nice name. They learned certain techniques to avoid falling into their traps. However, it was not easy for Tog either, as the king was changing spells quite quickly to defend himself, so he realized he was dealing with a mage with at least 4 Thieth-class magic. Jared, meanwhile, had to think of something quickly, because if he stopped for even a moment, he would be counterattacked, so he had to act ahead of his opponent. The king's knights stood next to the carriage, watching this difficult battle, but Tog's team was completely confident in their leader's victory. Suddenly, Tog noticed the staff and immediately realized what it was. It was a magical artifact for mages, and he needed one, so Tog immediately launched another attack. But Jared caught the stick, pulling the enemy before him and using magic that increased his physical strength many times. The assassin staggered back, almost dropping the staff from his hands, and he noticed that something had changed. The mage had become too strong in his last blows. At that moment, he stopped moving at all. Jared had blocked all his physical abilities, which he had boasted about so much. Just one spell of paralysis magic was enough. Now, it was very important for Jared to find out more about the strange masked man who had assigned this task to the assassins. He suspected that Tog would keep quiet and tell him nothing, but to his surprise, the mage killer exclaimed that he would tell him anything he asked if he was spared and left alive. Jared stood beside him, the king holding a magic wand in one hand and a large hammer in the other, ready to listen to whatever Tog had to say. But there was one problem. He didn't trust criminals at all, so without waiting, Jared swung the hammer at the murderer. Sitting in the cave beside the robber's lair, the little boy listened intently to everything happening outside. He remembered the old saying that a traitor without money can't buy luck. He was talking about himself because he hadn't been lucky at all lately. He began to knock on the door, already knowing that all the guards that had been hired were dead because of Tog. Suddenly, he heard someone talking about a drug dealer, saying that he had good merchandise and probably a lot of guards. However, any guard would have fallen before Tog's hammer. He was too strong, so it was easy for him to deal with a few people, even armed ones. Tog was negotiating with this stranger about the task, and had already said he could prepare the full amount because he had never returned in defeat. Still, the masked man said he would give the other 2/3 of the amount after completing the task. He realized that this king was no ordinary man because he could cure all the sick very quickly with his potions and easily obtained all the ingredients. Also, the young man in the black mask was sure that Jared would go to Ronella to get a lot of money from selling this precious medicine for a severe disease that was common there. They both set out to wait for the king's carriage to pass by on this road. The information from Tog's servants was always reliable, so he didn't even worry about whether they had chosen the right place to ambush him. The boy listened with horror to all this talk. He knew that these fierce killers had killed 11 people in the last 7 days alone, and he wondered why there were no brave men who would dare to catch such a monster and stop all these horrors. But it seems he had found one, Jared, who had the strength and courage to end it all. The boy was amazed at Jared's skills, defeating a boss who never left a fight unscathed. Meanwhile, the king rose into the sky and created a large sphere of fire, looking at his opponent, who was also paralyzed in one place. The boy was very happy when he saw Jared fighting so bravely against this monster, who had terrified many people in Krivia's territory. He had hope and even some confidence that this boy would be the warrior who would save him and take him out of this dark place. The boy was thrilled and smiling, and he thanked Jared very much when he rescued him from this terrible place. Jared was happy to have saved him and to hear the gratitude and praise. However, he wished there had been some distance between them because the boy hugged and kept up with him. The younger man blushed and pulled away from him, beginning to apologize. He was so overwhelmed with happiness that he didn't even notice. He told Jared that he had come to the land to make a deal about the crystals, but had been attacked by Tog and his gang. The king apologized because there was no good security in this area. Outlaw laws were rampant, and Jared was really uncomfortable in front of him. But the boy reassured him because he had survived thanks to him. He thought he would stay in this dark cellar until he died of hunger. From his past life, the boy remembered that Arcanez was the most potent NPC ruler who bought a kingdom in the east for a gastronomic price. Using his extraordinary powers of foresight and fashion analysis, he identifies trends. He takes over all the popular products, and users who are startup merchants follow him and thus expand. Jared was surprised that Arcanez was near their kingdom at such a time. He was curious to know what brought the boy who would become the most popular and powerful ruler in the east to these lands. Nevertheless, Jared decided to help him a little more and offer him something because it would be tough for Arcanez, both psychologically and because he had lost everything. The king offered to give him 15% of the profits and asked that he sell all the medicines he had prepared and would sell in Ronella. Arcanez thought it would be much better to sign a contract with him first, get him interested, and then hire him, which would be much more profitable. After a while, the kid told Jared that he would refuse the profit Jared had promised him, but he wanted him to fulfill 2 requests. Hayes sat silently next to Arcanez and listened to their conversation, and the boy suggested that he could find a perfect place to sell drugs and he should just trust him. Jared immediately agreed, but said he could refuse, depending on the situation. Arcanez relied on his feelings, which had never failed him. Now, he was sure that everything would go according to his plan and that the king would listen to his request. So the boy made his first request, which sounded very strange and simple. He wanted Jared to call him Aki, and the boy blushed a little at these words. Standing next to Jared, Isabella could not say a word when she heard such a request. She could not understand how he could give up a good profit and exchange it for this. But anyway, the king agreed, but Aki had to make his subsequent request later. Later, they reached the kingdom of Ronella, and to their great surprise, it was very different from what they had heard about this place. It was not gloomy and dull. The kingdom was entirely of life despite its decline. Arkeen's and Hayes began carrying boxes they had bought from local merchants to the carriage. The boxes contained bundles of paper. Ranella was doing well indeed. If only the disease problem could be solved, the kingdom's potential would be maximized immediately. Jared turned to Aki. He was grateful to him for helping them open their business in a good place. But it was just a thank you for everything the king had done, even though it seemed to him that it was not enough. Later, they put everything in its place and removed a large barrel that Aki thought was supposed to contain the cure for the disease. But as Jared had said, it was not ready yet. He took a small bottle and turned the faucet so that a red liquid began to pour into it. When he closed it with a click, the preparation of the rare magic herb was complete, and his skill in making healing herbs rose to level 2. Thus, Jared managed to achieve the highest scores of the day. However, there was a downside, as he thought certain limitations were immediately triggered. It took several months to complete the process when he didn't know about the glitch and had just started taking the medicine. Jared went to Aki and handed him a small bottle of medicine to sell. The king told him to tell a customer who wanted to buy the medicine a few features of the medicine, and he didn't have to wait long. Talon came to the counter, and with the help of his spiritual eye, Jared immediately saw that the man was infected with Ranell's disease. Talon was amazed to see such a low price for a medicine that was so important for this kingdom. It cost only 1 gold. Aki smiled sweetly and said that this favorable offer was especially for him because he saw that Talon was a very good person. Then the man began to suspect that this was just a trick and that there might not be anything good in this medicine, but Arkeen still convinced him to buy the bottle. Talon didn't feel sorry for the 1 gold piece because he would die soon anyway because of Ranell's disease. So the man gave him the money. All that was left was to sign the contract that Arcanese handed him. It all sounded very strange because he was just going to buy the medicine, so the contract confused him, especially since it said that he would have the right to the medicine. But he had nothing to lose, so he signed the paper with a pen and opened the bottle, drinking it all on the street. Jared kindly said that it would take at least 30 minutes after taking the medication to feel its effects. He added that he would always be here so the man could rest and come back as soon as needed. Of course, Talon believed the little boy and bought the medicine, but he still had his doubts that it was just a scam. But Jared could vouch for the medicine, saying he would refund his 1,000 gold pieces if no action was taken. Talon said nothing to this and simply walked away from the counter. While Hayes and Jared continued to carry everything they needed for their small shop, Arkin said he had to prepare something else for the trade. Jared had a new dose of medication to prepare for, and he had another achievement to reach for the highest score in 24 hours. And he succeeded. The crafting bug was working perfectly. In the game paradise, the skill of making medicines depends on the products from which they are made. According to the criteria of his potion, the penalty that could limit the skill level is 24 hours. However, he is thinking about transferring the rights to make the potion to another user. The following user can have all the data except the skill level already applied to his information. In this way, the penalty of a 24-hour restriction would also be transferred to tolling. 2 hours had passed in this speculation, and Arkeen's was still nowhere to be seen, and Jared was beginning to wonder where he was. However, he continued to believe that he would be back soon and that everything would be fine. Indeed, he and Hayes didn't have to wait long as they heard a loud noise coming their way. It was incredible. A crowd of people with Arkeen's chasing them at breakneck speed. Hayes didn't know where to go, but she hoped that none of these people were running toward them and would bypass the small island of Oak with the medicine. However, when they saw Aki and their first customer up ahead, they realized they were all heading towards them. This crowd of people pounced on Jared, but Hayes stood before him, trying to protect him. They all demanded that they be sold the cure for Ranell's disease immediately. There was no empty space near the island. Everyone who stood there wanted to get ahead of the others and be the first to receive the healing medicine. Absolute chaos could not be stopped. However, they both liked to hear the joyful comments and praise. Now, Krivia's status was rising in the eyes of other people because they had developed such a valuable remedy. But these comments were followed by quite the opposite ones. People remembered Krivia's past when everything was terrible there. They again called the king a fat pig who had only recently changed his mind and started to change something in the kingdom. Here, Aki decided to take matters into his own hands and loudly announced to everyone that he would sell this medicine here and only today. If they wanted to buy it any other day, they could come to Krivya alone. There were rumors that the nightmare forest of Krivya was almost untouched by hunters, and that there were still many monsters there, which would definitely attract hunters one day. The guy went on to say that such a thing can be found with great difficulty in the territory of the kingdom of Ithima, and will cost twice as much. Aki, thus encouraging even more visitors, said that everyone should stand in line and not push, as there was enough medicine for everyone. Ultimately, they gave away the last medicine jar when night fell, and all the customers went home. Hayes was so tired that she slept like a log, and Jared was happy to see how much he had earned under the starry sky. The amount was really big, as much as 12,250 gold pieces. If you converted this money into the currency from his past life, it would be 12.2 billion won, which would be enough money to live on for years. Suddenly, Jared heard a voice behind him asking if the king was pleased with this income. The boy turned around to see Aki, who didn't seem to be exhausted after such a hard day's work. The boy approached him, holding a coin in his hand, and said that he had come for the next reward, the request he had left. At first, Jared did not mention their agreement about the 2 wishes, but then he calmly told him to ask for whatever he wanted. Aki gathered his thoughts and took a deep breath. His subsequent request was to become Jared's servant and be in charge of the merchants' union in the kingdom of Krivya. Aki got down on one knee, bowing his head before him. He had too little experience yet. He was only 20 years old. But he promised to try his best to make the merchant union the best in this part of the continent if Jared trusted him. Jared appreciated Aki's courage. Even though he had been robbed by bandits and had no money left, he had not given up and kept going. The king smiled and said he wanted to make Aki his servant when he saw his abilities. Still, the position of head of the merchants' union, which is the core of all trade, would not be available immediately. Aki was a little worried. Although he had expected this answer, he hoped he would have a chance to continue working with the king of Trivia. However, the request had to be honored, and he was also confident in the boy's abilities. So Jared agreed and decided to give Aki a chance to prove himself. The insight that made him see the potential for Krivias's development, his desire to get high, and his courage to speak about it directly were all great advantages of Arkini's. But luck played the most important role here, because the place was currently free. Jared liked Aki, and knew that the trade union headed by him had a great future. Aki could not believe his good fortune, but he was immensely grateful to the king, who was already very sleepy. He said goodbye and told him they would return to the kingdom tomorrow. To tell the truth, Jared was happy that they would finally return to the cold lands of Krivia. As he walked to his room, he again admired the starry sky as the warm spring breeze enveloped him. Thanks to the herb mixing bug, his crafting skill grew to level 35 this time. As a reward for passing level 30, they gained knowledge of the automation of the production process and the technology of producing medium concentration potions. Using 5,000 gold and 10 curvature crystals, 24 test tubes of potions are produced daily. So if you take 39 gold for each, the net earnings will equal 900 gold. The medicine could be bought only in their kingdom, so monster hunters could safely hunt in the nightmare forest, so the number of crystals in Krivia would increase, and the damage from monsters would be less and less. In addition, traders from other kingdoms also knew well what the territory of Krivia was famous for. Therefore, they did not miss this opportunity to improve their earnings and began to come to the kingdom often for additional benefits. In the present day, only good things kept happening in Krivia, even beyond Jared's expectations. The potions they made became a starting point, and the king's achievements began accumulating. Hence, the mainland gradually began to recognize the name Krivia. On one of those days, Jared went to a very cold place where not a single soul was present, and Isabella did not waste the opportunity and came to him again. She thought he was going to this horrible place to kill himself, so she couldn't let that happen. They weren't married yet. He looked better now than in years, so Jared couldn't possibly be a ghost. But that wasn't why he was going there. He was going after the monster DeLuca to catch him, and Isabella had told him not to throw around such words and to stop making up stuff. But his idea frightened the demon even more, and she refused to let Jared go on such a dangerous mission. Lich is a powerful dark wizard who has been cursed, and if Jared is caught, his soul will be taken from him. Despite Isabella's warnings, the boy remained very calm, confident in his own abilities, and knew everything about Deluca's methods of attack and further actions. Deluca is a Laishi who lives in a hiding place he created and never shows himself to the world. He waits for his victim and steals his soul. In paradise, he was chosen by the Demon King and freed from his hiding place during the Great Sanma War, thus gaining eternal life. During the game's main story, all users had to go to a special part called the Wrath of Deluca. If Deluca became even stronger, he would no longer be affected by swords and magic, which is why there was no time to delay destroying him. Only divine power could kill him. Isabella had already realized she could not convince him to return and forget about this idea. He seemed very strange to her now if he was taking such a risk. In general, Jared knew too much for an ordinary person, so she thought he was some kind of god pretending to be a simple guy. But he shouted at her to stop making noise and coming up with such ridiculous things. It was driving him crazy. After a while, Jared reached the hideout of Deluca himself, the most potent lich in the game of Paradise. He went inside the cave and began to explore it, remembering where the events in the game took place. Jared was trying to find a small crevice, and it was very difficult. He had already thought that it had disappeared when the game turned into reality. Isabella was flying around the whole time and noticed that he now looked like a cute dog looking for a bone. Realizing that it would be better to stop talking such nonsense, Isabella flew closer and asked him what he was looking for if Jared had come here for Deluca. The boy explained that he first needed to find the passage to the high mountain, because without it, he would not find the left. However, he remembered that there were many traps that were almost impossible to deal with. At the entrance, they were met by the frozen corpses of people who had also tried to get there, but this attempt was unsuccessful. But his desire to catch Deluca was still greater, and soon he found a passage that could lead him to the desired place. He began to fall through the wall through the secret passage, which frightened Isabella. He only now realized Isabella's shock because this magic passage was another bug he had found himself. This will most likely cause an invisible passage to appear on the map, making it possible to destroy Deluca. The two of them made their way to the Lich's secret room, which was full of gold coins, precious jewelry, and valuable weapons. It was actually a reward room for those who could defeat Deluca. These treasures were designed for a large number of people, so it was no wonder there were so many of them. There were also more than 10 artifacts in this room that the winners could take away. Jared wanted to find some of them, and as he approached one of the shelves, he noticed what he was looking for. It was a ring that had belonged to a greedy man named Melt, and it wasn't just any ring, it had something magical. When Jared put it on his finger, gold coins fell from the jewelry, almost flooding it. It was a spatial bag that could expand to unknown limits. Isabella had advised him against stealing the Lich's things. She was a powerful, evil spirit, but she could not defeat Deluca. But Jared didn't consider it stealing. All those precious things and money were taken from the unfortunate people who had been in trouble here. The forest had killed her on the spot, and so much had been gathered here over the years. The guy wasn't going to just take everything for himself. He wanted to punish this Deluca on behalf of everyone he had killed in his lair. And now they were almost at the very place where the mighty evil in the form of the Lich was sitting. He was chained to his own throne with thick chains because many years ago, a woman had lost a vein of vital energy, and after that, Deluca had never been able to rise from this place. All he dreamed of was freedom, freedom after which he would take ruthless revenge on all the people on the mainland, making them suffer for eternity and feel the same way he had been living for decades. Suddenly, Jared approached the Lich's throne. He heard everything the old man was saying, and he should have thought about his behavior, not continued to spin vile thoughts of revenge in his head. The guy put his hand on his head, and at that time, Deluca could not turn to him and look into his eyes. After that, without answering the question, Jared used magic. He used a flame that could burn any dead person in a few seconds. Jared wanted to be the only hero in this world who would defeat the evil that rages in the universe. The boy's flame showed the true figure of the Lich Deluca, a skeleton without any living space. His dark cloak continued to burn while it was on his bones, and then, looking at Jared, he asked in a low voice how the boy managed to get around all the traps set. While the throne was burning and the flames were not extinguished, Jared quickly jumped away from the main evil of the continent. Before him was a cursed magician who had gained a terrifying amount of power that he had exchanged for his humanity, an act that violated all the laws of this world and knew no pity. Such magicians can create a specific image for themselves and endow it with powerful magic. This image is controlled by the magician's thoughts and can act far away from their own real body. Deluxe had lost this vein of vital energy because of a sacred maiden. Because of her, his soul was held hostage by his body. He was weakened, and if he died this time, he would not be able to rise again. Now, Jared had to be very careful not to get too close to the magician, lest he use dark magic that could drain the victim's life force. In his past life, Jared had already fought DeLuca more than once after being freed, so now he had to do it again, but not through a computer. Continuing to keep a certain distance, Jared summoned arrows of lightning to hit DeLuca. But for a magician like this Lich, such techniques would be too easy, and he would easily dodge the arrows if he were full of power. But now he was almost at zero, and Jared wasn't the weakest of opponents. DeLuca was also confused because he could feel the divine power of eternal fire in Jared's body. Now that he understood what was happening, he noticed the ring of the Holy Maiden who possessed this powerful magic. After all, as strange as this was, if DeLuca wanted to live, he had to think of something fast. Jared laughed, however, and approached him with his sword, wanting to play with the Count a little longer. Jared realized that it wouldn't work on DeLuca if he didn't interrupt the attack. However, although he didn't manage to destroy him from the first punch, if Jared continued at the same pace, he could win this fight. DeLuca noticed that the man seemed to see right through him. He knew his techniques, but it was still evil territory. To help him, Deluxe summoned the knights of his dark dungeon, who rose from the ground to defend him. A stranger had invaded their kingdom, so the Lich ordered them not to wait and to deal with the guest. Deluxe shouted for the guards to block Jared's path to him. Isabella panicked, appearing next to his head saying there were too many evil spirits here. However, Jared remembered that in the game, these knights appeared where traps were set, so he assumed that everything had changed after he had been resurrected once again. The guy reminded the Count of all the suffering he had endured throughout his years, and since he had already managed to absorb the divine flame, he offered to fight in a fair duel. Jared devised a plan, realizing that he needed to block him in any way possible before the Lich could use higher-level magic. Isabella decides to take over all the guards supposed to protect DeLuca, so the demon allows Jared to think only about how to defeat the main boss. When Isabella flew into the skull of one of the knights, he looked around nervously at the others of his kind, who slowly began to retreat. She began to control him from the inside. Of course, the monster's appearance was so-so, but the flesh was firm, so it worked for her. This was not good because if it continued like this, they could reach the Lich in no time. DeLuca decided to deal with the additional problems first, so he threw Isabella, who was wearing the remains of the flesh of one of the knights, away. The skeleton nearly shattered into individual bones from the impact, but Isabella was unharmed. This played into Jared's hands, because while his main enemy was distracted by her, he could quickly attack by surprise, which would have strengthened the blow. The King of Krivia used powerful magic again, using the Sword of Lightning, and with the next blow, he decided to finally finish off his enemy, picking up a magic staff with incredible energy. But the second time, DeLuca would not lose. He protected himself with a powerful shield, a stable wall that completely covered him. But the fact that Jared could use two spells at once was not good for him. But that was his specialty, double magic, a big plus against such a powerful evil. Jared remembered that when he played Paradise, this Lich had lost every time he used those lightning bolts, so the guy had put a certain quality into his strike. Thanks to this spell, DeLuca was even more bound by the chains. Jared stood calmly, trying to regain his breathing, and Isabella, still in the bones of the Dark Wizard's Knight, looked at DeLuca, whom they had defeated, in amazement. She was sure that she had a lot to do with it, and Jared would have had a hard time without her. However, as soon as the boy was near the Lich, he seemed to come to life and began to move abruptly and scream loudly. Jared struck his arm without hesitation, knocking him back onto the throne. Jared used the ability that Isabella had given him. He knew such spells would not kill DeLuca, but they would exhaust him. So the boy sneaked up on him and repeated his super-powered punch. Lich screamed loudly. He could not believe that this was what his death looked like, that it was going to happen right now. This was the first time he had felt the fear of death since becoming a Lich, and his instinct was to avoid this guy, but he could not do so because of his chains. The powerful Lychee, who terrified everyone who came across him, spread mortal fear. He had power over death and could not say goodbye to life so easily. All the anger boiling inside him broke free, but the chains that held him still had not broken. Deluc, in his new form, offered to fight the young wizard once again. Jared rushed at him without waiting a moment, protecting himself with a strong shield. The flow of magic from DeLuca was too powerful, although it could hardly be called ordinary magic. This super powerful force had broken the barrier behind which Jared had been hiding, and now he stood unarmored before the powerful lich. Isabella couldn't let Jared die so quickly, so she continued to manage the Dark Knight's work and came to his defense, deflecting DeLuca's blow. Leech was furious. He was once again prevented from achieving his goal and ending this fight with his own victory. DeLuca ordered the Dark Knight to disappear from his kingdom, and the bones flew in different directions. Now Isabella could not help him in any way, but she still believed that Jared would find a way to overcome this evil. The boy was also confident in himself. He knew DeLuca would never defeat him in the game or in real life. Initially, he was a little confused by his appearance and method of attack, but his basic techniques were still the same. This boss appeared most often in Paradise, so he studied its weaknesses and techniques for defeating it. All the methods of attack and defense were well known, so nothing prevented him from reading Decluck through and knowing how he would act in a particular situation. Jared was moving too fast for such a slow lich, first of all because he was chained, and secondly, Decluck was much bigger than the guy, so he decided to crush him with his own weight. Jared had just a few centimeters to dodge the lich's attack, but he missed again and could not reach his primary target. Jared stopped at this point, trusting his intuition and knowledge, but the lich took it as a shock. For Jared, challenging his biggest fear was easy if you have confidence. At this point, DeLuca wondered why his opponent was only dodging. Was he really going to destroy him in this way? Jared caught the right moment and held his magic staff next to the enemy's head. He used 4th grade magic, stabbing the staff into his chest. Only now did DeLuca realize his plan. The guy was deliberately using low-level magic to mislead him, and it worked. Besides, Jared was confident. He was 100% confident, which gave him a head start on the fight and the victory. Now it was time for the final stage of the fight, and Jared strengthened his magic with the chain of the Holy Seal and bound his enemy even more tightly. After the boy locked DeLuca in with the holy object, there was no way he could get out. He put his hand on his heart so that the evil one could feel the full power of the divine blessing. There was noise all around, and DeLuca kept trying to escape the trap, but it was all in vain. Isabella hid behind him and told him to give up immediately because the Demon King he was waiting for would not come. After hearing this, DeLuca lost the strength to fight, but he did not stop threatening them with a terrible future after what he had done. The demon was already almost completely underground, pulling him in very quickly to close him within its walls. In the last seconds, the demon asked if the young magician could handle the next stage. Jared very calmly replied that it was still quite a long way to go. The 9th class of magical abilities could be considered the actual endpoint, and he had only 4 so far. However, DeLuca had been sitting quietly and dying all this time. He didn't understand why the guy had come to fight him. But the boy had a simple answer. He had to finish off the most powerful monarch on the mainland. DeLuca considered it all just childish games, and besides, all these treasures were covered with the blood of innocent people. Jared wanted to get what none of the great knights who had been given their powers by the deities could, what the Demon King himself could not achieve. DeLuca was interested in this young mage with such ambition and fierce confidence, and he would watch the developments from hell itself to see if Jared would pay too high a price for his enthusiasm. Isabella was frightened by this guy at moments when he seemed ready for anything, and his instinct for self-preservation was simply turned off. Many people in the world were much stronger than him, but Jared didn't care about that, as if he knew that sooner or later he would be able to climb as high as he did. When DeLuca's lich was gone, Jared finally picked up the thing he had come here for, a large bracelet that was an artifact of growth. Nothing was better for him now than this precious thing, but Isabella saw a strange book before her. She immediately told the boy about it. The current king of Krivia walked over to the book and picked it up. It could have been something Lich had left behind after his death, but it was very strange because the boy had never picked up anything like DeLuca's books. He looked at the binding, realizing he was holding a book of spells for resurrection. It turns out that the object resurrected by the wizard cannot resist his wishes. It simply becomes his subordinate. If someone decides to try to go against these rules, he will not just die, but disappear forever without a chance to return. As Isabella read a few pages of this strange book, she realized that it was more like slavery than a gesture of goodwill from someone. She wasn't going along with this. A demon would never allow herself to be bossed around. But Jared interrupted her tantrum and told her to tie him up first. Isabella was quiet momentarily. thinking she had heard something wrong. Jared said that she should use a curse on him and he would be patient. And Isabella liked that because she also liked similar things. The guy also emphasized that when the spell was repeated, the strength of resistance and resilience would increase significantly. It would be ideal to hire a powerful wizard for this, but it was too expensive, and Isabella would do it for free. The demon looked at him as if he were a man out of his mind as soon as she found a flaw in him for the first time in all her time. With some hope, she asked if that was all he had to say to her, to which Jared replied that he would think about the rest. Isabella agreed. She was tired of living in the body of an evil spirit anyway. When the boy heard this, he immediately went to get the body he had found to resurrect her, but she didn't think it would happen so quickly. However, there was no time to dawdle on such a step, so very soon, Isabella was transformed into a new person, and in the first minutes, Jared thought he had done it in vain. It was hard for him to carry her all the time on his back, but it was hard for the former demon to get used to a new body so quickly, and she also asked to be called Isabel. Although her appearance had changed a bit, her character remained the same, stubborn and hot-tempered. Although she said she had forgotten everything after the resurrection, she did not like her old name. Isabel began to pester him to walk faster because it was very cold. He was just as perverted as DeLuca, and if he had worn the same clothes, there would have been no difference. He was pleased that Isabel's readings remained the same, but her temper was almost impossible to tolerate. It seemed that she had become even more emotional. But she changed the subject. She was more concerned that there were so many corpses lying around. But Jared reassured her and told her that they could relax because it was an area with traps he had managed to disarm. When she was still in the demon's form, they came to the body Isabella was about to move into. She asked Jared if he knew how the girl had died, and when he said he had no idea, she was glad because he was not a know-it-all. Isabella hoped the girl hadn't become an evil spirit because this life makes you tired very quickly. You feel almost nothing but cold and lonely. While they were going through all these passages, Isabel even thought that this girl would be very grateful if she lived a decent and enjoyable life in her body. She suddenly decided to eat a lot of delicious food, go on adventures, and dress beautifully. She hinted that she could not escape Jared because he was never dull and sometimes even dangerous. She leaned against his back. She felt good now, and Jared was happy to have a good partner. Meanwhile, the number of monster hunters was decreasing significantly. And the reason was that the cure for Ronell's disease was only available in Krivia, and they all went there. But the king of the kingdom was very disappointed and angry, and he specially allocated a large sum of money to hire specialists and produce a similar medicine to bring the hunters back here. But the problem is that in Krivia, they are cautious not to let the information about the healing potion leak out, and they barely managed to get one copy, but it was not enough. But the man was too angry. He didn't understand what his wards were doing if they couldn't even do that. He threw open the door and kicked him out of his office, telling him to get out. This little Jared was so brazen and had no fear of anything, which did not please the head of this state. But he decided to try his own way, which he had recently invented. He sent his men to Majorca to negotiate a treaty with them. However, such actions could provoke a war. If this happened, they would be guaranteed to lose. Very few warriors were ready to tear the enemy apart. But the ward said they had 1239 soldiers ready to do anything to protect the king. However, this was still not enough to strike a fatal blow and defeat the enemy. They said that Jared had level 4 magic, so his army would be mighty. Now this was not that stupid fat pig. If he had known that things would turn out this way, he would have ordered Glagus to kill him immediately, but he was no longer there. The assassin sent by the master had destroyed Glagus. During this time, while the question of the army was being decided, the one for whom Horgus had been waiting for so long came to the hall. The magician Akron returned, bringing with him several people. These were powerful magicians whom they had gathered on Horgus's orders. They had already taken a lot of money, but the king had given permission to spend as much as necessary. Horgus approached one of the magicians, who was wearing a cloak, and asked him what class of magic he had. The man replied that he was of the 3rd class. So if they were to attack Krivia now, that kingdom would disappear in a day. This was great news, and finally they could go into battle. Meanwhile, Jared had just entered a forest in the northern part of the continent. His men had heard that he would establish diplomatic relations with neighboring countries. However, he denied it because it was unlikely. Their closest neighbors were Majorca and Ranella, with whom they always had wage disputes. So Jared was going to negotiate not with kingdoms but with tribes. Very soon, everyone will know about everything. You just have to wait a bit. And when that moment came, the king's ward almost fell off his horse, and he was very frightened. The man saw a flock of red goblins holding weapons and not being kind to the guests. Oberyn, who also went on the trip with them, was shocked. He knew a lot about these places, but this was the first time he had heard that red goblins were found here. Now there was nowhere to go. Their vehicle and all of them were surrounded by a tribe of red goblins that were getting closer by the second. The elders immediately shouted out to the knights not to think too long and to defend His Majesty from the enemies, who were so numerous. Lacus, who led the whole team, ordered them to be ready to defend themselves and never attack first. It was strange that they were preparing to defend themselves against some monsters. But now the knights calmed down a bit because the head of this tribe came out to them, who seemed to be in the mood for negotiations. Ibaniba was the leader of all the goblins in the tribe and was ready to discuss the issues with which the guests had come to them. Aubrey was surprised that there was a goblin who could speak Nara. But Jared stepped up to him and introduced himself, saying that he had come from the kingdom of Krivia specifically to meet him, and that Ibaniba remembered the leader of that kingdom. He looked much better than he thought. Jared made his request. They wanted to start diplomatic relations and exchange their own resources for their gold and iron. The leader of the Red Goblins was really pleased with this desire because Jared was the first person to offer such help. However, the tribal king had a sixth question, and it was important to him that the boy should be able to accept their estate and soul. The next moment, a cartload of nightmare stones appeared beside them both. Jared wanted to show his friendliness and get them to make a treaty between them. King Krivia's wards were embarrassed because they were just ordinary stones, plentiful in the nightmare forest, and had no value. Lacus knew that the nightmare stones were only beautiful on the outside. Hunters often took them for themselves, but as souvenirs, so using them as a bargaining chip could have serious consequences. Ibaniba said what Lacus had been thinking, and he also knew that the nightmare forest was full of these stones. Usually, no one wanted these stones, but the king brought them as a barter item, and at this point it was clear that they were in big trouble. But the head of the tribe did not need anything else. He was so happy that he had been brought just such a thing. Ibaniba shook Jared's hand and said that he was very grateful to him. The boy had brought the nightmare stone, which was so important to them, the goblins. This creature signed the treaty, and they became one big family in the north. Jared was ready to say goodbye and move on. He thanked the wisest king of the Red Goblins once again and hoped that their friendship would only grow stronger in the future. Ibaniba called out to his men and told them to bring the gold and iron they would exchange. They were showered with these resources from head to toe, and the goblins were so happy to receive the nightmare stones that they had already made jewelry out of them and could not stop admiring them. Their hearts beat even faster just thinking about how they would grind these beautiful stones. It turns out that these goblins have many minds. Since they can extract such valuable resources in such quantities, there was already a thought of driving them out of these lands and taking possession of them ourselves. Just as Jared was about to leave, he was stopped by Ibanib, who said he couldn't let them go because they had signed a treaty today, and there was going to be a big party to celebrate. After that, the leader shouted a little louder to those hiding in the bushes. They no longer needed to hide their presence and could safely show themselves. After a few seconds, a few strange creatures appeared, a little timidly, but still. They looked more like humans, but they seemed less friendly than the others. They were dark elves, a warlike tribe that alarmed people because they mostly lived somewhere in the depths of the forest and did not treat others very well. But the king knew about them too. Jared knew about everything that happened here. The Red Goblins, who live in the northern part of the continent above Krivia, never appear to people for no reason, but that doesn't mean they are close to humanity. This tribe had close relations with the Dark Elves living on a neighboring island, so close that they signed a joint defense treaty. Ibaniba had high intelligence and wisdom, which allowed him to conclude peace treaties with many tribes. He did not fully understand human culture. It was new but exciting. At that moment, Jared was glad that he knew so much about this game, because if they had attacked the Red Goblins, they would have stayed here forever and been killed. Later, when it was getting dark, they had a party with drinks and lots of food, but Jared's mentee was still curious to know how he remembered so much about the area. Now, several different cultures have united into one big family. They did not see each other as enemies. They saw each other as partners, and they could turn to each other for help. After some time had passed, Jared called Lacus over to his office. He asked if the workshops and forges were working correctly in their kingdom. Lacus replied that weapons production was suspended due to the lack of specific resources, so now they were working on improving the existing weapons. So he ordered them to send all the iron they had received from the goblins that day to make swords, arrows, and other defensive weapons. Lycus accepted the order and nodded his head. Now, all that was left to do was complete the task. But Jared snapped at him and told him that half of the gold they got would go to the kingdom's army. He instructed Lycus to recruit soldiers in his place. Iba, sitting next to them drinking something, overheard their conversation and asked curiously if they were going to fight Majorca. There was only one reason why Krivia needed so many resources: war. He approved of the decision because Majorca had become a haven for criminals, and if left to its own devices, the kingdom would continue to exert a terrible influence over neighboring states. Jared apologized, thinking he might be upset that they were preparing for war using their resources. Iba assured him he didn't mind. He just wanted to speak out about the situation. In any case, the amount of gold and iron meant nothing to them, and he did not like Horgus himself, so he supported the decision. After the conversation, Abanaba, the king of the Red Goblins, exclaimed that it was time to drink with the newest son of their family, King Jared. Everyone raised their mugs in the air, shouting a round of applause. Eventually, they returned home, and active preparations for the war continued. Isabel tried to get used to her new body. 4 weeks had passed since then. Jared introduced her as his classmate, with whom he had been studying at Desmond Academy, and she got used to living in the palace much faster than Jared could have imagined. Every day, Isabel helped him develop his own magical abilities. Her magic level was at the 2nd stage, and it allowed her to give people hallucinations in the form of their fears. She created a giant spider, which the boy was very afraid of. Isabel could not understand why he was screaming so much. It was just a common spider. Thanks to her, Jared managed to improve his skills to level 34. After the next training session, he handed her 3 candies in his hand. But the girl didn't want to eat them because she was worried she might get fat and spoil her beautiful body, which she had recently moved into. But he decided to think of something, saying that today was a special day, and that was why he had given her the sweets and asked her to eat them. She didn't know what kind of special day he was talking about, but he was making it up, even though it was White Day in the real world where he used to live. He said that on February 14th, according to tradition, she was supposed to give him something sweet, but now, a month later, it was the other way around. Listening to him talk like that, Isabel realized he was very romantic. She thought he had finally started to like her. But he denied it, saying that he had given it to all the girls in the palace, which upset Isabel. But she didn't show it. Instead, she opened the candy and ate it. This guy was very interesting. He used her daily for training and didn't want to give up his heart. However, she would not give up and leave him so quickly. They were bound by the spiritual eye and the kiss of the eternal contract. There was no time for jokes, so he pulled away. He needed to continue training, and since he had increased his defense, he suggested that he increase his magic by a factor of 2. Isabel agreed and said she would push him with all her might. She was using the magic of lust, which she knew just fine from her past life. But Jared screamed with all his might to stop her from doing it, but it was too late. After the training, he left to take care of further business to prepare for the war, and she launched a project to train disciples. The essence of this project was to use the spiritual eye to find people of the future with good abilities and lure them to their side first. Besides training talent, there were other reasons for Jared's bold investment in this project. The main one was to capitalize on the mutual reward system, in which a teacher receives bonus stats according to the progress of his or her students. A teacher can have a maximum of 4 students. Isabel was the first to show results. She didn't mind becoming his student, but in general, she was not eligible for it after the resurrection. Lena also joined his team and performed all the tasks assigned to her conscientiously. She was ready to do her best. For Mia, it was something new and very interesting, like a big game. She was very happy to be taught such magic. And when Jared saw his students practicing hard and progressing with the traps he had also taught them, the plan began to go incredibly smoothly, or so he thought. But there was a but. Hayes walked into his office. She was a mere servant, and did not think she had the right to call the king her teacher. It was impossible for her, which is why unforeseen circumstances had arisen. She, of course, wanted to show some progress and become the best healer, but her level of progress was 0. It was a special profession that differed from priests in the ability to heal. Her specialty was supposed to be in this, but no more than 5 such healers could be found on the entire continent of Nars. Apparently that was the case. He exhaled, realizing that he might lose his student. although he had initially had high hopes for her. So he stood up from his chair and began to scold her because she always put herself in the frame of a maid and did not value herself. He realized that everything should be in its place and did not want to lose such a person. However, to become a healer, Hayes needed to feel the title with her whole body and soul. She had been a maid in this palace from the age of child until she was 23, and breaking that mold would not be easy for her. Something inside her was holding her back. Perhaps she had a defense mechanism on a subconscious level or was too pessimistic. He needed to choose the right direction for her, but he didn't know how. Jared put the cup of tea on the table. Then, Oberyn continued to speak. Their king had found new and diverse ways to solve the problem, and every kingdom citizen was grateful to him. However, Jared was not obliged to be responsible for absolutely everything. Physically, he could not do it because no one was to blame for Hayes' inability to achieve any result. All that remained was to believe in her and support her because the girl was trying her best. She was also his person. Jared had once promised to make her a healer, and he was doing everything he could to make her one. And then he realized what the older man was getting at. Jared's traps that had worked for his other students might not work for Hayes. There had to be a very honest way to get her power to come out, and as soon as he said that, he was attacked from behind by a guy who had appeared unnoticed. Hayes saw this and immediately ran to his aid, and she immediately entered the room where it happened. However, the king was lying unconscious on the floor, unable to defend himself against the attacker. The girl put her hand over her mouth, quietly asking how it had happened. One of the knights standing nearby with Jared's body told her that the king had been attacked by a hired assassin. They had called for the best doctors, but the situation was getting out of hand and ordinary human power might not be able to help. And even if there was enough medicine, it would be too late by the time the doctor arrived, so there was no time to wait. She was tormented by the thought that she was the only one here who had trained as a healer, and only Hayes could help this disaster. The knight did not leave the king's side, and then Hayes approached, and she decided to take matters into her own hands. Focusing only on this case, she mentally begged that she would succeed and be able to save Jared. Tears welled up in Hayes' eyes as the energy blob faded away, and with it, the king's life. But the girl couldn't let him go like that. She promised to help him all her life. When Hayes closed her eyes, her memories were only of the moments with Jared, who believed in her despite all these difficulties. A miracle happened. She was so overwhelmed with emotion that the energy she had been unable to release for so long finally broke free, leaving the entire room green. Half an hour later, when everyone was sitting in the room and explaining the whole situation to the girl, she was so angry with them, even to the point of hating them. Hayes couldn't hold back her tears because even if it was all done for her and her opportunities, it wasn't how a king pretended to be mortally wounded. Jared calmly told her it was just animal blood and that his wonderful plan had worked. Even though it had made her hysterical, she had been able to reach a new level. She didn't like being a healer if he would play with her like that. She was also very angry with Jared's other wards, even if it was the king's order. How could they scare her like that? Unable to withstand the pressure, she ran out of the room in tears. Oberyn, standing behind her, quietly said that he didn't quite mean it. That scene was too cruel, but the project to educate the students was going really well. Meanwhile, Lacus was wandering through the snowy lands of the kingdom. There was an extremely strong blizzard, and he was almost blown away by the wind. Suddenly, he noticed a bright light in front of him. He didn't expect to see anyone else in such a blizzard, so he checked it out and walked on. And when he got close enough, he saw a bearded old man who recognized him. Mr. Olson invited him into his home to warm him up and give him tea. He remarked that the younger man had grown a lot since they had last seen each other, and that it would no longer do to call him a little boy since Lacus would be turning 40 this year. Olson asked how Lacus had ended up in this nightmare forest when they got the fireplace going and piled wood on it. Lacus had a mission to accomplish here, and he thought of Mr. Olson very often, so he wanted to start by giving him a gift he had brought. Lacus pulled a bottle of red liquid from his bag. It was Renella's medicine, a necessity for those who stayed in the nightmare forest for a long time. Olson had heard much about this medicine as rumors spread throughout the kingdom and the mainland. The old man heard what people were saying, how much they praised the medicine, and he wondered how such a stupid king could devise such a brilliant idea. But Lacus told him that Jared had repented of his past and had changed his mind, which was why the king had sent him here to ask Olson to return to the kingdom. The man laughed. Jared had once abandoned him so easily, but now he wanted him back just as easily. However, Lacus insisted that the man return because they needed experienced veterans like Olsen. Lacus assured him that when he saw how much Krivieri had changed, he would immediately change his mind. Until now, there had not been so many wars on the Nars mainland, where crowns had seized land, an incredible number of lives had disappeared, and a large number of rulers' heads had been chopped off. Family ties or anything else did not help to escape death. You could get on the horse of death and ride at breakneck speed to the north. Jared held a mug of cool beer, which was incredibly tasty in Krivia, and because they were near the sea, all the seafood was very cheap. But Isabel had a different opinion. It was too cold here, and nothing grew because of it. This frost bothered her the most. Jared could only hope that his pesticides would do some good this time. However, Hayes was sure it would work because Jared had made them himself. She also noticed that everything on the land had been cleaned up. Even the roads were better. It was all thanks to Aki. He said he would set an example for others and keep everything clean and tidy. But some people were sure that Jared was the only one who had made the kingdom of Krivia rise from its knees. If there is a cure for Ranella, a potion, and full support from the kingdom in case of Ranella's illness, things will only go up. So Jared is asked to consider expanding the territory. It would be great to move their Hunters Guild headquarters here. It was something to think about, but seeing that they had found many valuable things in each village was good. Jared looked off to the side. A girl exclaimed loudly that the beer here was delicious, just incredible. She held up her mug and asked for another round. She turned to the girl and asked if she wanted another beer, but she was sitting beside her, chewing quietly. Jared kept his eyes on her. He remembered this character, the same strange sword warrior named Ella. This is a very famous character in the game Paradise, who constantly helps the main character solve difficulties. For money, Ella tried to persuade her friend to take another cup of beer, but she resisted, saying that alcohol blocks the brain and mental abilities. But that's all. This beautiful character had her flaws, but for a good amount of money, she was ready to help even the devil himself. Then Jared turned his attention to the girl sitting next to Ella, someone he had seen somewhere else while playing Paradise. Her name was Chloe. She was quite calm and quiet, so she was called the Queen of Silence, but it was not clear what she was doing in a place like this. He couldn't believe his eyes that this was the same Chloe who, 5 years after the Great War, at the age of 38, would play the role of the Queen of the Dark Elves, a mystical character whose story the game developers had hidden for the purpose of the biggest match. Jared didn't remember Ella appearing in the north, and he shouldn't have known about evil at this stage. It was unexpected to meet two such important people in one place at once, and it probably wasn't a coincidence. So he couldn't miss this great opportunity to talk to these people. So Jared quickly got out of his chair, leaving the others to continue talking, and went to the table where the two lovely ladies were sitting. Soon he was behind them, and deciding to start a conversation, he came even closer. But before he could say more than 2 words, Ella sent him away, saying she was not interested in babies that way. The plan was a failure. Such a quick end was not expected. Jared collapsed to the ground and Hayes ran to him in a flash. She put her hand under his head, telling them to be a little more polite to him because Jared was a high-ranking member of the Curve. Everyone in the room immediately looked at him, realizing that he was none other than King Jared of Krivia, and it was hard to believe that he was sitting in such a place. However, Ella did not like Hayes' response at all. She was just a maid and did not dare to address Ella herself in such a way. She also held a high position, and there were many places like this in the world. But Jared got up from the floor and gently put his arm around Hayes' shoulders, protecting them in front of Ella. He was willing to pay her a lot to accept his request. It was unexpected for their first meeting, but she thought about accepting it and apologized for her rudeness. She just thought he was an annoying guest at the pub. Jared assured her that everything was fine and suggested they go to a quieter place to discuss the terms of the agreement. In the study, Jared made his request. He was willing to pay 5,000 gold pieces a year and give her his personal house so that she could teach his students. The king even said he would pay the money up front, but a contract must be signed. Chloe would have done whatever her mentor told her to. No matter where they went, people lived the same way. This request was a little strange. Not knowing these people at all, the guy asked Ella to do this. She herself had just recently started teaching Chloe, and it was all new to her. The girl asked if he trusted her to sign such a contract. Jared, of course, didn't trust either of them yet, but he had his own plan for all of this. Besides, he trusted who he paid. He knew perfectly well that Ella would not refuse the sum of 5 billion won, the currency of his previous life. However, He also remembered from the game that her character caused her to fail to gain recognition among the influential characters in the future. It was the most tempting offer she'd had in a long time, so she accepted without hesitation. Chloe drank her tea silently and waited for the child worth 5,000 gold pieces to enter the room. Jared was happy because the problem of finding a good teacher for Lena was solved. It was very late, but the boy was still awake. Thanks to Gorgias's pendant, Jared didn't feel tired when he wore it. He had forgotten a lot of information, too much for one person. Today, it is hard to even remember Wicked, a popular character. Given the rapid development of the kingdom, it would be tough to record anything about him. In fact, he wanted to leave the notes in Korean so that no one could read them. It was a book that held the knowledge of the whole world behind its cover. The following day, Lena and Chloe trained together. It was a little tricky for the girl at first. Still, she remembered the promise she made to the bark, especially herself, so she kept going and moving forward. It was indeed a hell of a workout. Jared only hoped she wouldn't become an overly pumped-up and murderous monster if she kept up the good work. Chloe was working just as hard, but she didn't even seem to be tired. Ella replied with satisfaction that the world was too big for Lena to be the only talented child. There were many equally or even more talented individuals. Whoever had taught Lena before, she thought, was a lousy teacher. Ella could have killed anyone in 5 seconds without hesitation when she looked at Lakis, who looked like a weakling to her, but at least he deserved 5 seconds. Despite the fact that Lena didn't study with the best, Ella recognized that the girl had a rather high speed. Thanks to the magical tools, she instantly grasped everything. There were 4 homing elemental spells that were enclosed inside. They were very well suited for training the ability to use the shield. Jared was asked many questions about how he was able to find such perfect training for Lena, and he only answered awkwardly that it was a special way of training on the Eastern continent. Due to a particular system, the experience growth will decrease if you use the same training method. Still, if you use 4 different elements, the system will recognize them separately. This bug bypassed the anti-macro training system. However, Jared was very impressed that Ella had recognized Lena's condition without using the spiritual eye. But he was sure that there was nothing to worry about. Given Lena's progress, the training was very practical. In the meantime, Mr. Auburn returned to the kingdom, and the other servants and knights were very happy to see him back. The old man came back only to check on the progress of the crops. Everything was as usual. After they had killed all the pests in the fields, everything was going like clockwork. And because these pests were migrating to the territory of the kingdom of Ronella, the neighbors were eager to learn the secret of cultivation. These people were very grateful to Mr. Oberon and their lord for allowing them to work in these beautiful fields every day. Oberon felt responsible for all of them and also thanked them for their hard work. When he sincerely thanked each farmer, they were very touched. It was very nice to hear. The united voices of all the farmers saw their leader as the kingdom's king, so Jared completed the task of sincere recognition and received 200 points of loyalty. During this period, the Golden Age came to the territory of the state of Krivia. Thanks to this achievement, all abilities related to production increased by 100% within a month. There was no end to the joy of the farmers' clan, who continued to praise their lord, shouting his name and clapping their hands. The other processes in the kingdom were also in full swing. Everything was in full swing, and everyone had their own job, which they were very good at. Jared could not understand what was happening in Krivia under his rule, but he realized it was his merit. The smile did not fall off the guy's face. Of course, many envious people could not rest because Krivia had such a good reputation, but recently little was known about the welfare of this kingdom. Even though both lived in the northern region, they were definitely ready to die for such landscapes and destroy everyone who lived there. The man had come from a neighboring kingdom and bowed low when he saw the lord who came to meet him. Akron was from Majorca, and he had come to the kingdom of Krivia to deliver a personal message to the king. Jared smiled and welcomed him into the palace. He shook hands with the man, and they began to discuss the relationship between their kingdoms. Jared asked if the previous amount satisfied the lord of Majorca. Akron hastily replied that the lord was very pleased because Jared's decision was commendable, given the poor relations between Majorca and Coivia. The boy didn't say anything, but his mind was in chaos. Akron made it sound like Majorca was superior to Coivia because they were honored. Lakis stood beside the king with a dissatisfied and stern face, not letting a single word pass from either of their mouths. After all the points discussed, Jared asked if he could see the message Akron had brought to the kingdom. The man immediately took the envelope in his hands and handed it to the king, telling him that the lord had written the letter. When it was in Jared's hands, the boy opened the envelope and read. Lord Myokri wrote that after looking at their relationship, he realized how badly he had treated the king and his territory. However, he still dreamed of peace and harmony between their vast and wonderful lands, so the man suggested that they try to build further mutually beneficial relations between the kingdoms. A great friendship began with small steps. In his mind, Jared was very angry with Horgus because he was holding him to nothing by suggesting such an idea. The boy dreamed of peace between all countries more than all of them together, so he was outraged by such words. Still, Jared said that very soon he would send the best crystals from his entire kingdom to confirm the beginning of a strong friendship between the countries. Akron looked at him with satisfaction. Having fulfilled his lord's main order, Horgus must have been very happy with this outcome. Despite his irritation, Jared smiled gently, saying she would always be welcome in Krivia. After the representatives of the neighboring kingdom of Majorca went home, Jared went outside with his bow and arrows to hunt prey. It was already evening, and the sun was setting. His target was a deer that appeared out of the woods, and an arrow immediately hit the animal. One of the warriors standing next to Jared shouted loudly to the others that the king was down. The guy was also an excellent archer, a multifaceted person who was constantly developing. At one point, Lacus approached his king and quietly asked why he was so submissive to these bastards from Majorca when the agreement was that they should have been distancing themselves from their influence. But now he had to think about his life. Sooner or later, someone would be the first to take up the sword in the battle arena, so for now, it would be better to wait and put on a smile. Now, Lacus understood Jared's plan. He thought that the enemy would let down their guard and become more secure if they hid their true intentions for the neighboring kingdom at the beginning. As they both stood a little distance from each other, Jared emphasized that the last blow is always the best, as long as you don't put too much effort into the destruction and preparation for the process. So he quickly turned and suggested that everyone celebrate their province's rapid development. A huge banquet could be thrown. If Lacus had learned and fully realized the relationship between Krivia and the Kingdom of Majorca, he would not have been so worried about the coming wars here. He played along with Jared and smilingly said that he would not have any worries, especially since the Golden Age had come to their country. It was too safe for Jared and the rest of Krivia to say that, but it played right into the hands of their enemies. For now, they could enjoy the moment, but hell was about to break loose for the entire kingdom that had just risen from its knees. The following glass they would drink from would be filled with their own blood, and they would just have to wait for the right moment. Thanks to the spiritual eye, Jared could see right through the guy, and he knew his thoughts. Jared was prepared for spies to roam their territory, and this guy was well into his character, having a good background in intelligence. As soon as the spy gave all the evidence to his lord, they would immediately go to Krivia with the army. Jared was already waiting for this moment when they would come to their territory and then realize who they had contacted. After a few glasses of alcohol, Jared felt sick and went to a tree, leaning on it with his hands. Lacus again blamed himself for the king's condition because he could have taken better care of him. The banquet was over, everyone returned home, and the whole month, which had been full of expectations, passed relatively quietly. And today, the enemies took up arms and marched with the whole army to Krivia to destroy their rivals. They were all full of enthusiasm, and the desire to take the lives of the people of Krivi drove them crazy, and gave them even more thirst and confidence in their own abilities. Lena was training with Chloe as usual, and she stopped for a moment to rest, and noticed that the whole castle was very suspiciously quiet today. The girl asked Chloe if she had seen where everyone had gone, but she didn't know or care. Suddenly, her mentor appeared behind Lena's back, and Ella angrily said she had not allowed her to open her mouth during the training. These words were followed by a punishment. Ella ordered the girl to run 20 laps around the training ground, so Lena quickly ran to fulfill the task. Ella already knew about Jared's intentions, but she didn't understand why he hadn't told her about his desire to start a war before. He wasn't thinking when he didn't tell her. She couldn't just sit still if something like that happened, even though Jared might have been against her hand in the war. And suddenly and unexpectedly, something flew at the warrior who was supposed to be keeping a close eye on the kingdom's territory. It happened by surprise, and because of their unpreparedness, the soldiers of Krivia decided to fall back to save their lives and inform others. The watchtower of the enemy of Majorca was destroyed, and it was necessary to redeploy the guardsmen and possibly even a special unit as soon as possible. However, their lord objected to these ideas. It was not worth wasting so much time and manpower on such trifles. He already thought that Jared had only one battalion, so he was pleased. Although if he had known it would be so easy earlier, he would have captured his kingdom much faster. The other soldiers found an excellent supply of alcohol, which hundreds of soldiers kept in their storerooms. This news cheered the man up even more because Jared seemed more and more worthless with every step they took forward. The soldiers of Majorca raised their swords, adding to the army's morale. They were about to take back what was supposed to be theirs by right. The people who lived nearby came out of their homes, hearing the soldiers shouting so loudly. Yesterday, everything was fine, but today they were under threat, and everyone was worried about the Lord. Jared was informed that the enemy troops had already broken through the fourth line of defense. Given their speed, the enemy would soon reach their location. Jared had planned everything long ago, but he didn't think they could advance into their territory so quickly, so he had to speed up. The king turned to Lycus. He was his right-hand man, and Jared could rely on him in any situation. It was crucial to hold this place now, because if it was captured, there would be nowhere to retreat. Lycus set about fulfilling the order, and at the same time, an excited Hayes ran up to Jared. She didn't know why he hadn't taken her to this war, and she begged him not to leave her out of it. She tried to persuade Jared that she had healing powers, which would be very useful to many on the battlefield, but the king was adamantly against it. The arena that their kingdom was now serving was too dangerous, a place where one mistake could cost one's life. Hayes' ability was scarce and could be indispensable during a brutal war. But despite this, he couldn't take her to a place where he could lose her. Hayes was almost in tears. She wanted to be useful to the kingdom and to Jared and to do everything she could to help, but no one could let someone they cared about go to a certain death, and he didn't want to lose her. Especially since they had been together since childhood as soon as little Hayes entered the kingdom's palace. He had always been there for her, and she really meant a lot to him, so he had a plan to keep the ones he loved safe. Jared had been preparing for this day in advance, and it had taken him a long time to think through all the details. As he held her hand, a memory flashed through Hayes' mind of when she had first arrived at the king's castle. Jared had held her hand in the same way, helping her to stand up. She had looked into his eyes with a kind of trust, and she needed to do the same here. Just trust. As she continued to hold his hand and look at him, Isabel appeared behind her. She abruptly grabbed Hayes by her clothes and pulled her back to the rear so that she could treat those who were injured on the battlefield in peace. Isabel promised to ensure that Hayes was in her place, and they parted ways. Now everything was settled, everyone was in place, and everything was ready. So it was time to go to war and make a living hell for the enemy. They had advantages. The soldiers had found a perfect position for themselves, but the army had only 300 men, which was very small compared to the enemy's manpower. This battalion had many talented soldiers, but it was still not enough to defeat the enemy. Lycus stood at the head of the entire army and directed further actions according to the king's orders. Now he was too thoughtful. It all confused him. An army that included so few people and 100 farmers that they were not suited to fighting. They didn't even have decent weapons or armor. The army was still grateful to those who responded and decided to help as soon as they heard the war was announced. Although Lycus was ashamed to ask ordinary civilians to take on such a task just because there were not enough soldiers. Everyone knew that Jared wanted only peace with Majorca. He even offered them a truce, but despite all the Lord's efforts, the enemies still tried to capture them and take over the territory. Even now, about 1,200 trained soldiers from Majorca, with all their equipment and gear, were approaching their positions. That is why all the civilians who were afraid did not have to be ashamed of it and could leave the battlefield of the great battle in peace. Lycus remembered his past when he was called to leave the kingdom and forget about Krivia. They told him that everything would soon fall apart, that the former king was dead, and that Jared was too foolish to rule the entire kingdom. Still, Lycus stubbornly insisted that he would stay. This caused indignation, because the man remained loyal to the king even after being thrown out of his job for no reason into the cold street. Krivia might not even survive this coming winter, with severe frosts that could wipe out the lives of all the state's inhabitants. But such words could not change his mind. If the kingdom died under the ice of frost, he would die with it. Still, he could not be persuaded, so these attempts were abandoned, and Lycus was told not to return here. When Lycus returned to the present, he heard the loud shouts of people who refused to budge. No one had the right to speak of Krivia in such a way. This kingdom had always been theirs and would continue to belong to this people. Thanks to the Lord, Krivia had become the place they deserved, and for the sake of their home and the king's sake, people were willing to fight with their bare hands against enemies who would come to their land. The people would never have given up their country to these bastards from Majorca, who could not even be responsible for their own words. It was better to die on the battlefield, defending what was important than to run away and die there. Then Lacus remembered those words again about the cold winter and Krivia's inability to survive the frost. And how wrong that man was then. He had never been as hot as he was now. The words of ordinary people who were faithfully and steadfastly ready to stand to the last inspired Lacus. So he ordered his soldiers to give armor and weapons to their new fighters. Suddenly, one soldier appeared behind all the barricades, running as fast as he could to tell him that the enemy was approaching and would be there soon. Lacus looked around the area, seeing someone approaching from afar. The thing they had been preparing for so long was about to begin. Everything turned out to be right. The warriors were indeed extremely close to the borders of Krivia, but something happened that they were not prepared for. It was not an army from Majorca, but Lord Ronella's troops approaching the kingdom. They had serious intentions of destroying Krivia and leaving no one alive. What he saw surprised Lacus. They did not expect another problem in their territories. Now the two armies of the kingdoms of Ronella and Majorca could be seen on the horizon. The Lord of Ronella, riding on horseback in front of his soldiers, shouted joyfully that he could already see the borders of the neighboring kingdom. The goal was close. A month before, the kingdoms had indeed argued for a long time about wars with each other, but they were pursuing the same goal: peace between the kingdoms and mutual benefit. Meanwhile, Horgus and Lord Ronelli were talking to each other while sitting at the table. The Lord was not wholly indifferent to the situation, but his resentment was not too deep either. Horgus asked him directly if it was confirmed that the ruler of Ronella had recently received a tribute from Krivia. He confirmed this and added that Krivia had sent them a large number of provisions to maintain friendly relations, and given that they had received enough gold, the financial situation in the kingdom was stable. This confirmation irritated Horgus more than anything else. This behavior was too cunning. He tried to persuade Ronell to think about it better and think about the future. It was suspicious when Jared suddenly started wagging his tail at them and being so nice after so long silence. As the percentage of their hunters fell, and this already large number continued to grow, Jared, in turn, continued to follow his plan and wanted to seize the territories of the neighboring kingdoms. Horgus decided this little guy was just scared because although their territories were expanding, they were not yet ready for something bigger. They concluded that this was why Jared bought the truce, to pay money. Horgus had studied Krivia inside and out and learned that the army barely had 300 men. Ronell was surprised at the number of soldiers. However, this information only confirmed their theory that Jared would buy peace between them by paying them. So they decided that if Kyria offered them a round sum, they would be satisfied and not attack, or at least Jared would think so. He sent Akron, a scouting mage, because the kingdoms had decided to declare their kingdoms allies. Ronell was even more shocked. He stood up from his chair, almost knocking his cup over on the table. But this action was planned, so they are starting to prepare for war with Krivia. A month should be enough time to prepare, and then they will attack them unexpectedly. It was just a brilliant idea. They decided to create a united front so they could crush Jared and his men more easily. After these negotiations, Ronell and Horgus formed an alliance and shook hands. At first glance, it might seem like a united force of more than 3,000 soldiers, but they had nothing in common. However, these two had absolutely nothing in common except for one enemy, which they decided to deal with first. Then, they would open the battlefield between their kingdoms. Ronell suspected Jared would be furious when he learned about their joint offensive. At this point, it would be too late to retreat and develop something new. All Ronell could say was that Krivia's barbaric decisions and actions would shorten his life by many years. Even diligent attempts to stop him would be futile, and it would be tough, perhaps unrealistic, to resist such a force. And while they were talking for so long, Horgus's army had already surrounded the whole of Krivia. It was very foolish of Jared to concentrate all the manpower on the front of the state and leave the bypass routes unattended. Ronell shouted loudly that ignorance is a huge sin, so Jared could say goodbye to his lands right now because very soon they would pass into their blood-stained hands. Ronell also added that if the kingdom decided to beg him to have mercy on the people, he would still take pity on them and not be too cruel. The boy who stood before the soldiers reached for his helmet and slowly took it off his head. And it wasn't Jared all along, but a guy wearing similar clothes and having a similar build to him. The spy who was watching the king nearby saw this picture and realized that it was all a trap. They had no idea where the real Jared was. He ran back as fast as he could before anyone else noticed him. He had to tell the Lord as soon as possible before it was too late. But before the spy could take a step into his own territory, Krivia's men suddenly intercepted him, and they did not allow him to report his plan. But the soldier next to him said that if a person like him, who is responsible for public order and health care, is so shocked that there was indeed a spy, then what should they, ordinary soldiers, do? But then the guy said that this spy was the man who allowed Renella's army to invade their lands. This guess made him realize that Krivia had discovered his identity even earlier. Then the knight realized that all the information he had previously received from them was an absolute lie. He was so angry that the spy could only redeem this guilt with his death. A few days before, Jared and Lakis had talked again about a possible offensive and the kingdom's actions after the war began. Here, Jared was sure that the two armies would choose the main road as the primary path for the front between the kingdoms to unfold later. But Lakis told us about his version. He thought that the armies of Ronella and Majorca had two possible offensive options. Near the main road, it is very easy to ambush and attack by surprise, and Horgus also realizes that he will likely lose his soldiers while Krivia is occupying the hill. Jared agreed with Lakis's thoughts. Anyone would notice their geographical advantage. Ronell then asked Horgus what option they had left to take action, and the Majorcan leader said that after careful research, he had found a bypass route to the kingdom. Jared suspected that if their spy was good at what he did, they would find out about the bypass road. Since the guy was pretending to be a lumberjack, he probably already knew the road to the smallest detail. So Jared decided to lay one of his traps on this particular path. He was holding a landmine in his hand. It was a magical device that caused a magical overload of magic reception, and because of this, a powerful explosion occurred, comparable to the power of 4th class mages. This measure was his personal creation. Lakis had never seen anything like it, so he was curious to test the device's capabilities and asked the king for permission. Then Jared asked him to stand behind him to show him how it worked, and the man was shocked because he didn't remember when he needed to be protected like that. Then the man pulled the string attached to the mine, which was supposed to transmit a magic signal that would set off the mine. The mine they had placed on the stump lit up when this impulse reached it. A short moment later, a mighty explosion occurred, blowing everything around it apart and throwing out a lot of magical energy. Jared instantly created a protective barrier that protected him and Lakis from the debris flying in their direction. Lakis was really shocked. This power was really very powerful, and it was exactly what could level them against a large number of soldiers in the enemy army. The explosion left a large hole where the mine was located. This weapon was unique. Therefore, with the help of this spy, who would deliver information about the secret path, Jared could destroy the enemy with one explosion. Their land would not turn into a battlefield because the forest would become a grave for the attackers. This witty plan worked, and the enemy army reached the territory of Krivyi on this road, which would be their last. This road was a one-way ticket for the enemy soldiers of Majorca, and no one would get out alive. Horgus, who rode his horse ahead of the others, began to give orders to his men as soon as they reached the road. He shouted loudly that his army should dismember all those who would resist their authority and destroy everything that would stand in their way. And those people who decide to surrender to the army should be chained. With the beginning of this great war, the era of their wealth, glory, and rule will begin. The soldiers raised their weapons, shouting loudly. Horgus was greatly anticipating what was about to happen. He had already seen himself ruling over conquered lands. But something disturbed Lord Majorca, and he looked around where he saw Jared. The boy was ready to pull all the strings to end them. Horgus was wrong to shout at his soldiers to raise their weapons, for they were better off raising their shields and trying to survive. Sitting in the bushes, Jared pulled the ropes that sent the signal to the mines. He had placed one next to the other underground to maximize the effect, so the enemy army could enjoy his traps. They were placed very carefully and would explode in a moment under the feet of the soldiers from Majorca. Horgus tried to stop the horses from going so fast, but realized it was too late. They were already standing on dozens of mines that were about to explode. The mines beneath them were already beginning to shake the ground, and there was nowhere to go. Akron, the magician, called Isaac and Odium to work together to create shields and to begin using defensive magic immediately. Half of their army was already burning brightly from the mines that had exploded under their feet, screaming loudly as they were burned alive. The three wizards quickly stood in the middle of the road. They created a powerful barrier to protect those who could still escape. And then Renell heard a loud explosion from the side of the bypass road, which startled him. Now they were the only ones with significantly fewer advantages, not Krivia, who remained on the defensive with an army of 300 men. However, even without Majorca's support, Renell had 1,800 soldiers, so he did not think to stop. The man ordered to reduce to dust all those he encountered on the way, anyone who would not submit to their rule. Chorasis raised her shields and weapons, preparing to launch a defense and attack. Akron looked around after he took off his shield and asked Horgus if he was all right. Nothing had happened to the Lord, and he ordered a report on the situation. The news was utterly disappointing. Everyone was dead, except for the 500 soldiers who were walking behind them and didn't have time to get here at the time of the explosion. Horgus looked at the flag of his kingdom, which was burning miserably on the ground, and the Lord, a little confused, asked Akron what had happened to the other two mages. He replied that Isaac and Odium were also dead. It was a catastrophic situation in a brutal war. They had lost most of their army, and all the soldiers with whom he was going to fight Jared were dead. Horgus would never have thought that someone like Jared could possess such a terrible and powerful weapon that could kill so many people in one blow. Now, the Lord could only rely on Akron, so he told him that starting from this second, the mage should not move too far away from him. The Lord had already begun to think of a new plan to avoid an even worse situation. Still, another disaster came to him unnoticed when Jared rushed at Aaron, who was standing behind his king. He only had time to look back and shout his name when Aaron was already in the clutches of an enemy who was strangling his neck. Jared lifted him into the air, still squeezing his neck, and Akron realized that this appearance of the king of Krivia was just a staging to mislead them. But now it didn't matter if he realized anything. It was too late for him to know. Jared soared into the sky, never letting go of Akron's neck, and only went higher and higher. And this height was enough, so Jared let go of Akron and started flying down. The king of Krivia gave him a choice when he used ice magic against Akron. The man could have activated flight to avoid dying falling from such a high altitude, or he could have used a shield to protect himself from the ice storm Jared had sent. Having made either choice, he is still at a disadvantage because he will die from the fall, just as he would from a high-level spell. And yet, Akron decided to create a barrier around him to protect him from the spell. Jared seemed to have gone mad, coming up with such a plan and being cruel. Usually, in duels between magicians, they keep a certain distance from each other. After each has cast one spell, the magicians discover their opponent's power level. After a long mutual study, the mages bombard each other with chains of powerful attacks, mostly how all the duels between them went. But Jared lacked common sense in the situation. He was driven by a strong and indomitable desire to defeat the enemy, which prevented him from building a life of peace. The guy simply ignored the common sense vision of the fight and decided to get rid of his opponent in a bloodthirsty way, not giving him the right to live. After Jared grabbed him with both hands, they flew down together. Akron did not realize where this situation would go, so they could crash. But it was part of Jared's plan. He had created another magic circle while holding his enemy tightly in his arms. It was only then that Akron realized his intentions, although it was not clear whether they would have helped him in any way, because the meters to the ground were becoming fewer and fewer with every second. After a general overview of all classes of mages, the fourth class is definitely not the last among them. Even Horgus, who had filled the ranks of Majorca with criminals, was not strong enough for mages of this level. The Lord of Majorca spent a quarter of his fortune hiring third-class mages to work in his territories. Nevertheless, Jared had two reasons why he had screamed in horror when he saw his body in the mirror for the first time some time ago. In the past, his strength had been enough to conquer the transformations of the Lich DeLuca, who was famous for his power more than once. In comparison, a fat sack like Jared could only use fourth-grade magic once at most. His skills were balanced to the max, making him a perfect match for a mage of his level who was proficient in fourth-class spells. Although Akron's fighting skills were lacking, he was on par with Jared in magic. And this man was not as easy as he seemed, and to defeat him, you had to try hard and give it your all. Jared used the shield again to protect himself from Akron's attack. If you kept a good distance, it would really work, but this barrier had its drawbacks. It was very easy to break in close combat. So Akron punched Jared's magic shield with all his might, and it shattered into pieces instantly. Now the mage knew who he was dealing with. Because Jared had already used his own spells many times, he could study his magic perfectly. Jared used teleportation magic the next moment, creating a portal of different dimensions. He decided to use the fact that he couldn't use the magic of flight to prevent Akron's attack from coming at him. So he decided to use just such a trick and go through the portal while Akron fell to the ground, which would lead to his death. The magician was actually amazed by this. He knew that such a spell was part of fourth-class magic, but he would not have thought that the Lord of Curvature would use it in this fight. But over time, Akron could recognize his tricks, which he was actively using. Having thought it through, the man was in a favorable position, as he thought, because thanks to Jared's last attack, the person who would go through the portal would be Akron. The boy quickly reached out with his hand to his enemy, trying to grab him, but the speed of the flight prevented him. Now, it was up to Jared to stop the attacks. He had to choose how to act. Either he would stop the fire vortex, he would be caught in a few seconds, or he would fall to the ground and break. If the flames of Akron attacked Jared, he would die immediately. The energy of this magic was too powerful to withstand. Regardless of Jared's choice, he was bound to meet the same end: death. Akron was about to fall through the dimensional portal, and Jared was approaching the fire trap he had created. The magician of Majorca was very pleased with himself because even if the boy had survived, he would no longer be able to use the portal to get to another place. And even if he somehow managed to do so, Akron had a plan for that too. He would simply stop him at the entrance and eradicate him. But this overconfidence played a cruel joke on him, and Akron eventually fell, not into the portal, but onto the sharp spear stuck in the tree. Jared landed safely, using his own magic. Akron missed, even though he said he had studied the opponent's magic. He went down to Akron and told him that Akron's face showed that he was very embarrassed and confused. Without his magic, he was just a bumbling man. Jared shook his head, looking away. Thanks to Akron's last attack, Jared had managed to cushion his fall, and he shouldn't have attacked his opponent while he was on top. However, the ice storm that the guy used against his opponent accelerated Akron's fall. He had deliberately thrown himself under the magician's attack, making him the first to fall into the portal that served as a trap. He had seen him, and he had emerged victorious from that duel. He had also seen all his weaknesses, which he had managed to strike. People say that if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. If something looks too perfect and appealing, it probably isn't the best opportunity. From the beginning, Jared had been walking so close to him that it could have been over. Still, Akron believed so strongly in his brilliant plans that he stopped seeing the trap in them. Jared wanted to take revenge on him, and Akron, who had done so much evil and sowed panic among civilians, would find justice at his hands, not from his victims. Finally, the king completed the next task, for which he received 15 points of wisdom as a reward. Akron was such a miserable creature that he couldn't even touch Jared's robe. The boy crushed the magician's glasses. It was the last thing left of him. But a fierce struggle continued at the front, with both armies fighting to prove their worth. Several of the soldiers from Krivia had already been injured. Hayes sent her to the rear to save them with her healing abilities. Renell was no longer as confident as he had been at the beginning of the offensive. He had lost an ally for this fight, and the Krivian troops were already closing in on them. The fierce struggle continued. Jared's men had already finished off several dozen of Renell's soldiers. But they needed more men in the center, so the warriors turned to Lacus. Due to the lack of soldiers, the enemy still managed to break through the center and further into Krivia's territory. After the breakthrough, Renella's army was ordered to ignore the soldiers and use ordinary people first. They had already seen their victory, and how they would fill all their pockets with gold coins and various valuables, after which they would become rich and not know hardship. With such thoughts, they rushed into battle. The number of wounded increased every minute, and they knew no pity. Barrett, a veteran whom Lacus was able to persuade to return to the kingdom, had heard the kingdom's predictions about their troops' breakthroughs, but he did not think they would be driven out so quickly. Another veteran returned to help, but he noticed that Krivia's army was completely helpless without their presence. Apparently, this was why the Lord was looking for all the experienced warriors to improve the situation in the country. Lacus was very happy to see Barrett and the others, but wondered why they had come only now when the war had already begun. Barrett said that they had a good reason for doing so. Before coming here, they had put the warriors of Majorca in their place so that they would not interfere in the future. Now the master of Krivia, the great leader Barrett, and an equally great man, the current king of Krivia, Jared, were on one side of the front. 100 of Barrett's elite soldiers and 900 of Jared's army, all of them will continue to fight side by side against the enemies of their state. Despite all the past events, Barrett was ready to forgive Jared for all his past mistakes, but he would never forget the day he was released. The king praised him and said that the experienced warrior, a veteran, had done his hard work very well all the time. He had served well and for a long time, but then the king dismissed him. The old man was against this decision. He swore his loyalty to the kingdom, but Jared immediately interrupted him and said that the rules had changed, his father was gone, and everything was different now. And since the previous king, Jared's father, was gone, the next king would not need his soldiers. Barrett still did not understand how such powerful soldiers could be dismissed so lightly, but Jared did this to many soldiers. He dismissed almost all of them, and the reason for this was the lack of funds and other resources. Most of the money disappeared because Jared spent it all on his desire to enjoy himself and live a luxurious life. After that, the parasites took advantage of this situation and, led by Glagus, conquered Krivia without any problems or obstacles. Barrett's bodyguards were removed from their positions and fired one by one, and the soldiers who had been receiving high salaries faced a steady decline in their pay, and then they were removed from their positions as well. Olsen and the other veterans did not want to watch this. The state they had built for so long and stood for against all the invaders simply fell before their eyes because of the new ruler. So they all decided to disperse into the forest and quietly continue their lives among the tall, dense trees. Like all the other veterans, Olsen found it difficult at the beginning. Although he was used to holding weapons and similar conditions, he had to survive every day, hunt, and get food. Once again, he took his spear in his hands and went hunting. The spring snow was too heavy today, and the man already thought that he would not hunt anyone here. At this rate, he could not stop coming here. But suddenly, someone caught his eye. He could not see well because of the heavy snowstorm, so he came closer. It turned out to be goblins. They were gathering resources and were very surprised to see an old man in front of them. It was very strange that the goblins had come so deep into the forest. They usually did not do that. Olsen was already prepared to attack. However, after a few seconds of watching the stranger in shock, the goblins calmly continued their work. These goblins simply ignored him instead of attacking him alone with the whole army. The reason for this behavior was unknown to him. Later, he went home and told his friend about this strange situation. Olsen said that the goblins were collecting iron nearby, which also surprised the man. Apparently, these were the ingredients they had ordered, as they had recently sold many weapons to the military. Because the Lord did nothing but give orders to the workers, they worked all day and had little time to rest, and this schedule made them all very tired. It was tough, but because of that, they lived like real blacksmiths and had a good income. The blacksmith was very grateful to the Lord despite the fact that he did not spare him, literally throwing him with tasks. It was with his help that the man was illuminated by the flame of passion. The blacksmith also told Olsen to keep this information a secret because it was important to keep other citizens from knowing about the weapons they delivered. However, Olsen did not care about this. He was tired of these stories. Still, with the right decisions by the organizations, the drought problem was completely solved. The problem with the arrival of a new population was closed with the improved road network, and the attitude towards soldiers, the availability of new positions, and the recruitment of new talent were better than in previous years. Soldiers who had left the Krivian army due to dismissal returned to military service, all of whom gave Jared a second chance after he had done such a great job. These men stood shoulder to shoulder with Jared and worked together to defeat the monster that invaded their homeland. They were the best. The army of Ronella and the army of Majorca were simply no match for such a majestic force, and their blood was spilled on the territory of Krivia as proof of their defeat. Even though the enemy soldiers were outnumbered, they could not defeat the vast experience and skills they had gained over the years. These pathetic creatures could not even look the veterans in the eye. They were ashamed. Ronella's army was ready to kneel down and beg for mercy. Those who stood farther away from the front lines rushed to escape from Krivia's troops. Ronell was furiously riding his horse, retreating from the enemies. Some time ago, he was sure that he would win and become the best. In his eyes, Horgus was a real fool because he could not detect and think of the fact that there would be enemy traps on the bypass routes. They had allied in vain, so Renel and those lucky to be safe fled as fast as they could. Horgus was the first to leave, but was very scared when he looked back. He was frightened because he saw a magician chasing them, and he could catch up with them in a couple of seconds. But when the man looked closer, he realized it was not just a wizard, but Jared himself. Now it was too late. He caught up with them and sneaked up on Horgus, who was looking around as he disappeared from view. When Horgus turned around again, he saw no one else with him, and Jared had just flown up and was behind Lord Majorca. Jared looked thoughtfully at Horgus, who was looking down at him with fear. He told him to come down to Earth and compete here on equal terms, because he had no magic and could not take to the sky. Jared thought about it for a while and decided to do as he said, but Horgus would go down first in that case. The Majorca warriors shouted for everyone else to protect their lord from the enemy's spells, but Jared immediately shouted that they should stand back and not dare to come any closer. After this order, he got down on the ground with them, and all those in front stepped back, fearing his actions. Jared knew from the very beginning that there could be no peace. He knew perfectly well about their plan to conquer the territories of Krivia and their plans for an offensive, but Horgus stubbornly refused to believe it. These people wanted to take everything and everyone from the lands of Krivia to sweep away everyone who got in their way, regardless of whether they were civilians or soldiers. Now, he had to ensure that he corrected them all and that they would stop sowing such crimes across the Nars mainland and keep people in fear. He had to make sure that no one else would suffer at their hands in the future, that there would be no more victims who would end up in such a hell. For this reason, Jared will very carefully cleanse all his lands of every remaining Matrican and Renella soldier. At this point, the already bloody Horgus laughed. Jared's plan was almost unrealistic. The boy had stepped up to the enemy and admitted that he had made mistakes, but he was sure of one thing. Even the old Jared, who had been so irresponsible with his royal obligations and the workers he had given much work to, was better than this. Horgus exclaimed loudly, about to get up from his knees and strike Jared with his hands for saying such unpleasant things, but he pulled out the knife he had been keeping on his person. After he stabbed it painfully right into Horgus's leg, he screamed again, but this time in extreme pain. Still, Jared managed to calm him down and bring him to his feet so he wouldn't be so rebellious. He was writhing in great pain, but he warned him that it would not be over so quickly at this stage. If the general of all the knights found out what Jared had done here, he would surely bring his mighty and large army to avenge Horgus and his army. Meanwhile, Jared took out of his pocket the small green book he had been poring over for so long. He writhed in great pain, but he warned that it would not be over so quickly at this point. If the general of all the knights discovered what Jared had done, he would surely bring his mighty and large army here to avenge Horgus and his army. Meanwhile, Jared took out of his pocket the small green book he had been poring over for so long. Meanwhile, Jared pulled out the small green book he had been poring over for so long. He opened the book and began to flip through its pages, looking for something. Then he opened it to where he needed it, reading the name of the mighty general of all knights, Count Birax. He added that he would definitely not come here. Horgus, who was still sitting with a knife stuck in his leg, had already forgotten about the pain when Jared heard the name of the Count, and he asked him in shock how he knew his name. Jared calmly replied that it was a book he had spent countless nights reading. Its pages contained various records of people and events. He also found out that Horgus and Count Birax were related. While he was writing all this, thanks to this book, there was little that could be hidden from him. Then Jared began to proofread some more and flipped through the pages. Suddenly he laughed out loud when he came across another line. The words that Horgus had used to threaten him and say that the general would kill him. He was very amused. He abruptly closed the book, glaring at his opponent, saying that it was wrong of Lord Mallorca to think that a general of a knightly order from the Ithima Empire would come just to save his nephew. Jared was now talking about traveling more than 5,000 kilometers, overcoming the borders of all 4 kingdoms, and crossing so many territories was impossible. Besides, it's unlikely that Birax would be very sad about his nephew's death and would want to do something to avenge the situation. For a man like him, who only pursues power, fame, and wealth, for Birax, Horgus was just a thorn in his side. Jared asked Horgus another question. Would anyone regret the death of their lord, or would everyone be utterly indifferent to all the recent events, and his name would be forgotten in the next few days? Moreover, most likely everyone will only feel relieved that such an executioner, a tyrant, is no longer in this world, and people can breathe easily. Horgus's life was so miserable that he could not find a single bright spot to cling to. It was time to end this war, for which Jared was much better prepared than the other kingdoms, despite having fewer soldiers in his army. Jared stood over Horgus and nobly asked him what words he wanted to say in his last moments of life. At least he gave him that opportunity. But at that moment, Horgus lost his mind, pulled a knife from his knee, and prepared to attack Jared, screaming at him. But despite his efforts to rush forward and somehow harm the boy, he could not do so. Jared immediately used ice magic, and waves of snow knocked the unfortunate Horgus off his feet. After the snow had melted a little, Horgus stood frozen, looking like an ice sculpture. Now he would not be able to move and would cause Jared no trouble. The words he managed to say at the last moment were a terrible wish, the end of which Jared would hear only in another world. After he touched Horgus's frozen body, Lord Majorca was snowed under even more and began to crumble to dust in the snow. In the end, the task of the first successful defense was completed. He was well rewarded for it, and the value of his territory increased by 50%, regardless of how good the state of internal affairs was. Now Jared could at least breathe out calmly for a few minutes. With a sigh, the guy fell to the ground and closed his eyes, realizing that it was not over yet and that he had a lot of work to do. The Majorcan warriors, standing behind him and silently watching him, tried to be as quiet as possible so he would ignore them. Still suddenly, Jared turned to them with a displeased face. All at once, they raised their hands in the air and began to shout that they were surrendering, hoping to escape death. And Jared listened to them. Their armor was stripped off, they were put in chains, and they finally surrendered an easy victory. However, the king did not become complacent or focus on this victory. Instead, he disguised himself as a resident of Majorca with lackeys, and continued to move forward. From the very beginning, he devised his plan to achieve his main goal, and he persevered in spite of all troubles and obstacles. He wanted to take control of the kingdoms of Majorca and Ranella, so he continued killing their leaders. As a result of another struggle, Majorca fell to its knees under his army. The remaining soldiers begged for captivity and surrendered. On this day, the leader of Majorca changed. Such significant changes happened quickly. Now, Krivia was a free and independent state, of course. Those who wanted to capture it did not disappear, but they all realized that they could face a terrible ending in this case. That evening, Lacus approached his lord and asked what he was going to do in the future. Ranella no longer had any fortresses left, and the entire army was smashed to pieces by the Krivia military. It is unlikely they will have the strength to resist them after such events. Jared turned to him, and Lacus was right because the battle between the kingdoms always came down to the number of soldiers in the army. Now that Ranella was losing to Curia in that regard, Jared was determined that their next move would be to invade Ranella's territories. They had to do it as soon as possible so that they wouldn't have time to come up with any plans, and the fight wouldn't drag on for too long. However, after he had already made this decision, everything went wrong. The plan was shattered by the unexpected appearance of one man. General Capre, who served in Miseria, knew that the genius of this war, Horgus, had been killed by Jared, and his lands were under the rule of King Krivia. When they captured the lands of Majorca, they thus lost the reason to wage war and achieved excellent results. However, Jared thought in a completely different way than this man. He was sure that Horgus was not the only one responsible for the decision to go to war. He started to bleed, but he began to say something incomprehensible to Lord Capra. His excitement confused him. However, the latter did not listen to him, nor did they understand what Jared wanted. Capra said that in this case, Lord Ronell should pay a considerable fee because, as a peace-loving pacifist, he would not want to see his neighbor's territory involved in a bloody war. Jared did not express this opinion, but suggested that Lord Capre of Miseria had long been planning to seize Ranella's territories. All these stories about peace and pacifism were just a cheap show. Still, Ronell agreed to such terms of compensation and was very grateful for such an outcome. But Jared was not at all satisfied with this decision. He reacted quite aggressively and was already preparing to attack both lords. Without waiting another minute, Jared immediately cast the spell Ice Storm and wiped the two idiots out of his sight. And he wouldn't stop there. Jared used fire magic to release a fiery arrow from his hands. Then he decided to end the fight completely and shouted the spell Lightning Bolt, releasing it at the enemies. But Lord Capre calmly walked out of the cloud of dust and chaos that rose behind him, not even a scratch on him. Instead, Capre ran past Jared and struck him with his sword, which was now bleeding from the impact. Jared suspected that this magic might not hurt Capre. He was a B-ranked tank and unlikely to be affected by something like these spells. Capre was also the leader of the Central Territories, with a large army that outnumbered Krivia by 2-1. Hence, Lord Misery asked Jared again if he agreed to all the conditions. The boy had no choice but to agree to all the conditions because starting a fight with him and his state would be foolish. It would be sure death under the feet of the enemies. So Jared just bowed his head and tried to accept the fact that he could not do anything about it now. Besides, if he wanted to move from the north to the central parts of the continent, he would have to pass through Miseria. That would happen, but later, Jared promised himself that one day he would kill Capra with his own hands and put his state to rest. Everything was calm in Krivia for the moment. It was a quiet night, and Lena was sleeping peacefully in her bed, very tired after the hard training she had been doing under Ella's guidance. Ella was sitting outside in her bathrobe, sipping wine. The night was her favorite time of day, so she was enjoying herself. After taking another sip of the sweet wine, she looked to the side, quietly asking her friend what she was doing out so late. Chloe calmly stepped outside to get some fresh air. Her voice was monotone and quiet, as always, with barely a trace of emotion. The younger girl sat down on the chair next to her, and Ella noticed that Chloe had been very thoughtful all day, and not the first day either. She asked what was wrong and if the war affected her so badly. The girl's face was lit only by the dim flame from the candle on the table next to the bottle of wine. Chloe was not really worried about anything. She didn't even care about the war, but she still couldn't answer the question about Jared not calling Ella to help in the great battle. Kola cared much less about that question, but she assumed that the king wanted the guests to simply defend his home, not to take part in a dangerous war. Kola was a mighty warrior, but had come here only to train Lena. Chloe didn't understand why a warrior like Ella wasn't even asked to participate in the fight. But the girl calmly replied that Jared could tell that he had been preparing for this for a long time, and Ella picked up her glass again and took a sip. Chloe continued to speak hesitantly, not knowing whether to talk about it, but she had noticed it since their first meeting. It seemed to her that Jared could see into the future and thus think his moves ahead. During the holidays, she had quite a few opportunities to talk to him, and once, he asked if she was okay after training. As he continued talking, Jared knew that most Grey Elves were much more comfortable and safe in their territories. He wondered why Chloe had stayed in this world instead of living alone. Jared also knew about the horrible end her father had met when he saw the Black Years when they tore his flesh to pieces and feasted on his body. This alarmed Ella a little because only the Grey Elves knew about such details, and she was the only one who did because she was close to Chloe and told her about the situation. Jared also gave her one piece of advice. She should not only look for revenge in this dirty world. You should also examine the bigger picture and assess your options. Jared was a very interesting person. They had no idea how he could know about all the nuances of their lives. Ella stood up from her chair and took the bottle of alcohol in her hands. She suggested that Chloe follow Jared if she was so interested in this behavior. There was time for that, because they would not leave the territory of Krivia soon. She added that Chloe should let her know if she started to feel anything shortly, and she laughed and moved on. Chloe sighed and turned to her. This was a typical behavior for Ella, and even though she was her teacher, she sometimes acted like a small child. Ella stopped momentarily, not turning to face the girl, and began to make excuses, saying she had just wanted to ask Jared if he wanted a glass of wine. Chloe sighed again. There was nothing she could do about Ella. Freedom was an incredible feeling for Ella, but it was the reason there were so many double rumors about her. In Majorca, meanwhile, things were not so happy and peaceful. It was a dark night, and the moonlight did not illuminate the alleyway. As soon as they learned of Horgus' defeat, they began to panic and become angry. One of their leaders was so furious that he broke everything in sight. Horgus took with him almost all the state's soldiers, but they were all trounced, and after all this, he managed to die at the hands of the same King Jared. It was hard for him to believe that so much money had been spent on Horgus when he had assured him that everything would work out and they would win this fight. The man ordered them to collect all the money they had left and all the valuables in the room, and he gave the order to leave Majorca immediately. It was good that at least their trade routes were protected, so they only had to prepare for the future when they arrived in Renella's territory. Pura stepped out into the street when his guard told him to stop and look to his left in a slightly louder voice. The man exhaled, but Jared was faster and more cunning than ever imagined. Jared grinned as he stood in front of his army. Next to Lycus, the boy greeted his newest competitor. The king asked where he was going in such a hurry. Since his guests had just arrived and he was already running away, Jared used his spiritual eye to analyze Prua's vitals. He grumbled that he was moving because of a new job. He didn't want to waste time with someone like Jared and wanted to leave the place and his company as soon as possible. Pru had no time for jokes or any kind of tricks. But Jared was not going to joke. He was also a busy man, and right now he was busy killing Prua and his team. The man realized that leaving these lands with the intruders would not be easy, so he decided to do something else. He activated an artifact he always carried around his neck, a small watch. Thanks to this watch, Pru created a dome, which distorted time, and Jared's magic stopped before it could reach his people. Lacus was surprised to see that he could use spells because he was sure Prua was not a magician, and Jared confirmed this. The magic was not Prua himself, but his artifact, which had an effect that stopped the magic if it came within 20 meters or less. Then there was a problem. The artifact could only be affected by Class 5 magic, but Jared still had Class 4, which the watch would quickly respond to with a reverse effect. As Jared approached the barrier Prua had created, he realized that he had to do something to strike back, whether he liked it or not. Jared needed to be within 20 meters of his opponent to do so. Pru was shocked that Jared, a mage, would compete with him up close. Mages were supposed to keep their distance in combat, but there was no other way out. If Jared wanted to put an end to Prua's drug cartel, he asked him with an ironic smile if he was tired because the war had just ended, and he was already trying to catch him. Prua then offered a deal to stop the circus. The man said he would give him twice as much money as he was giving Horgus, or even 3 times as much if Jared would just turn a blind eye to their company. He said he didn't want to joke about a war with the new lord of their territory. Lycus was infuriated by Prua's words and intentions. He gritted his teeth, but stood still, waiting for Jared's order. The king realized that he would be making a mistake if he let them all go now, as in that case, all the northern regions would be under Dietrichari's control. In this case, they all faced a future in which Lena would be known as the impenetrable wall, and Prua would be the right hand of that tyrant, the advisor to the Demon King. So Jared was forced to kill people like Prua to maintain control and security of Machorka. Prua took his sword in his hands, ready to defend himself, and asked one last time if it was possible to arrange peace talks. When he got a negative answer, Prua rushed to attack. The children's time was already over, so he wanted to put him to bed immediately. But Jared was going to do it first, so he pulled up his sleeve, under which was a powerful artifact, a gold bracelet. This was the bracelet he had taken after DeLuca's disappearance. It had very good qualities, and if its level was lower than the enemy's, then its strength and wisdom would double. According to the 5th option of this artifact, all the functions were now available to him, and the fight was to become easier. Pru also activated his artifact for some reason and prepared to attack. Jared was ready to use his new nightmare magic on Pru, and the boy approached, creating a sphere of spell in his hands. When he released it, the sphere flew straight at Pru, who was below. He could dodge Jared's first attack and kept his eyes on him to avoid being hit. Prua and Jared were now on a level playing field, so he used the Sword of Speed spell and charged again. But one of Krivia's soldiers suddenly entered the battlefield, and he would not allow his lord to be injured, so he hurried to protect Jared. But Jared was against it because Prua was too dangerous and did not want a soldier to get so close to him and sacrifice himself. When Prua attacked the soldier and tried to stab him with his sword, he quickly defended himself by putting a shield in front of his face. Jared continued to fly in the air and tried to get close to Prua, who still had his eyes on him. To slow down his opponent and confuse him for at least a while, Jared used a flash, and suddenly, everything around him turned white. The flash blinded Prua, who tried to cover his eyes with his hands, and was stopped by the sudden bright light. Pru was already scratched up and had a busted lip. He was always amazed at Jared's power. He didn't even realize what kind of wizard he was because he could use some pretty unorthodox spells. Even though Jared was a mage, he was very good at hand-to-hand combat, and his magic was frighteningly fast. Pru had already begun to suspect that Jared was a 5th class mage, not a 4th class mage, because all of the guy's indicators pointed to him being a mighty mage. It was the same as fighting 4 dragons for Jared. He was able to see Prua's abilities and determine who he was. He was able to cut through the shield. By evaluating all the above points, Jared realized that Paul was a master of the Ko sword. But what was most interesting was that Jared felt no energy from the artifacts he used. Still, he did notice a black color around the sword. That meant that the sword was created specifically to fight magic, and Jared was right. The moiselle was the sword used to fight magic, and it was also the 99th sword of failure. Jared landed on the ground and began to slowly take steps forward toward Prua. The guy had suspicions about why he was carrying it with him. It was because Prua was too weak. The king continued to unbalance Prua, saying that he expected much more from such a person, and such words hurt him. But Prua reminded him that he had used weapons in the east before, and Prua held on with his last bit of strength to avoid rushing into a mindless battle. The king shrugged and smiled sweetly, but added that the artifact, a watch that Prua was carrying around his neck, was only an accessory that could somehow save the fight within 20 meters. It was utterly useless. This finally pissed Prua off, and he shouted at him to shut up. But this was the reaction Jared had expected. As Prua approached him with his sword, he quickly dodged the attack. And a moment later, he released a flame from his hands, which he directed at the enemy. Prua also skillfully sized up this attack, and the spell did not touch his body. Jared immediately turned around while he was busy with his last attack and ran in the opposite direction from Prua, simultaneously shooting at the walls of the houses that were on the way. In this way, Jared made large rocks fly at Prua, and there were countless of them. However, he quickly realized what to do next. He started jumping over them to get to his target, thus reducing the possibility of being hit by a rock. Jared ran down the alley just as fast, glancing over at Prue, who was close behind. He was about to strike Jared's legs with his sword, and he swung hard, but it didn't work. All he managed to do was to catch Jared's robe and tear it, leaving some of it down. He was very nervous about the results, but could not understand Jared's technique, which confused him even more. The king flew high into the sky, then turned to Prua and noticed that his speed was excellent. He even had to use a spell. But now it was time for the fatal blow, so Jared prepared himself and once again created a purple sphere in his hands. With all his might, he shouted the spell of lightning and the awakening of the night, and a purple light appeared amid the dark realm, shining brighter than the full moon. Jared calmly sat on the house's roof and told Prue to give up. The boy had too many advantages here, and if they were to fight with swords only, Prue would not be an easy opponent. He was much faster than any ordinary swordsman, and at the same time, every blow Prue struck was quite powerful. But despite all this, Jared was not within range of attack, for he kept his distance. Prue said with a smile that Jared deserved to be applauded in the analysis. But that wasn't enough. The man had improved his speed level by 1 more, and he was even stronger. And since the king was so good in the tests, Prue suggested that we determine who would win this difficult battle. Jared, still sitting calmly on the roof, confidently said he knew he would win this fight, which made Prue's fears even stronger. But he was already so mad that he began to shout loudly, telling Prue to stop talking such nonsense and take better care of himself. Prue once again improved his abilities and moved to the 4th level. Jared was a little scared when Prue ran straight at him with a sharp sword in front of him. His frantic look of wanting to win was really quite scary. But something unexpected happened. Prue himself ran into his sword, which pierced his chest, and he could barely breathe. Jared did not expect this outcome, so he walked over to Prue in surprise and looked at his wound. But the next moment, he was already smiling. With his confidence and strength, Jared could go very far. Deluxe and Prue were very similar, yet very different. They were both powerful opponents, but they both made the same mistake. However, Deluxe was getting weaker as time passed. His body was partially closed and relatively weak. Prue was at that time at the stage of rapid growth of his power. He was skilled in almost everything, and he had an artifact as an advantage. Jared was already experienced in this kind of fight. He could easily dodge DeLuca's familiar attack pattern, and then he would gradually deteriorate Prue's health with his magic, so he could be reduced to 0 and quickly end this fight. But if Jared let his guard down for just a second and got distracted by something, he could kill him with just 1 hit, whereas putting in too much effort was a strategy that suited Prue and Capra very well. It was problematic for Prue himself because Jared exposed his primary and special ability, recklessness. It was as if he had stepped on an accelerator. With this ability, he could improve his physical abilities very quickly, a feature that was a perfect match for Jared, whose basic skills were not that good. Jared laughed, realizing that everything that had happened was the best Prue could do. This artifact was the only thing that gave him a chance to win, but he couldn't help save the situation either. Jared was deliberately taunting Prue, telling him things that got to him so that he would hurry up and be reckless. The plan was slowly working. Prue had once admitted that he was stronger than Akron. He continued with this sore subject and reminded him that he had been pushed away by a mage in close combat, while mages were not very good at that. Prue had been dragging his feet for too long. The sun would soon be up before he decided to do something. Yet this was Prue's last straw. He took off running at Jared, his head filled with reckless actions. After such a successful operation, Jared used space magic to strike at Prue with his own weapon. In this fight, Prue made a mistake he would not have made in an ordinary battle. His inability to think straight played a key role in his defeat before the King of Trivia. Jared stood at a distance from Prue, repeating a phrase he had heard many times before. Keep your cool, but never forget your good heart. He asked Prue if he had ever heard that expression. After that, the boy held up a bag of drugs that had killed many people to whom their entire company had sold these illegal substances. Those who did not have any more money started to give it up, but they were very much in pain because they were drawn to buy another dose of drugs. Jared went up to Prue and shoved the bag of drugs directly into his mouth. It was his parting gift before the end of Prue's life, which he would have liked very much. In the end, their whole company was very proud to be in this business and sell this stuff to people. They said that anyone would be willing to die to feel this high once more.